Hello and welcome. I hope you all enjoy tonight's cryptid horror stories. Black-eyed kids. The fluorescent lights buzzed with an intensity that suggested imminent failure, casting a sickly pallor over the institutional gray walls of the interrogation room. Eric sat with his back straight, his shoulders squared, his eyes fixed on the camera lens that peered at him from the corner like the unblinking eye of some ancient deity. He wasn't crying. He wasn't screaming. He was meticulously scrubbing his fingernails with a plastic fork he had stolen from the vending machine in the hallway, running the tines under each nail with a precision that bordered on the obsessive. He had been scrubbing for 47 minutes. The detectives had stopped asking questions after the first hour, had stepped out to confer with their supervisors, had left him alone with the camera and the lights and the weight of what he knew. They thought he was in shock. They thought he was processing trauma. They thought he would eventually break, eventually speak, eventually tell them what had happened in that cabin in the woods. They were wrong. He was waiting for the right moment, waiting for the words to arrange themselves in the proper order, waiting for the strength to tell a story that no one would believe, that no one could believe, because believing would mean accepting that the world was far more terrible than they had allowed themselves to imagine. He looked at the camera, and his eyes held depths that made the detective watching from the next room shift uncomfortably in his chair. There was knowledge there, understanding of things that shouldn't be understood, acceptance of truths that destroyed the comfortable illusions of ordinary life. The mistake wasn't letting them in, Eric said, his voice soft but carrying a weight that suggested he was reciting words that had been rehearsed in his mind 1,000 times. The mistake was thinking they needed permission to stay. He set the plastic fork on the table with a click that echoed in the silent room. He folded his hands together, his fingers interlaced, his thumbs circling each other in a nervous gesture that was the only sign of the turmoil beneath his calm exterior. "You're waiting for me to tell you what happened," he continued, speaking to the camera, to the detectives, to whoever might eventually review this footage. "You're waiting for a confession, for an explanation, for something that fits into your categories of crime and motive and opportunity. But what happened in that cabin doesn't fit. It doesn't fit because it wasn't a crime. It wasn't even really an attack. It was a harvest." He leaned forward, his elbows on the table, his face coming closer to the camera lens. "You've heard of black-eyed kids, haven't you? The urban legend. Children who knock on doors late at night asking to come inside, and whoever lets them in disappears or dies, or worse. You've probably dismissed it as internet creepypasta, as modern folklore, as stories teenagers tell each other to feel scared in the dark." His smile was thin and utterly devoid of humor. "That's what we thought too. That's what we believed when we drove to that cabin in the Appalachian foothills, chasing a story that we thought would save our dying channel. We were content creators, man. We made videos for YouTube. We told scary stories, reviewed horror movies, explored abandoned places. We were fake ghost hunters chasing real ghosts we didn't believe in. And we found them. God help us, we found them." He sat back, his eyes losing focus as he remembered, as he traveled back in his mind to the beginning of the end. "Let me tell you about Jax. Let me tell you about Mila. Let me tell you about what we did and what we saw and what we invited into our lives. And maybe, just maybe, you'll understand why I'm not the victim here. Why I'm not the one you should be looking for. Why the real monsters are still out there, still knocking on doors, still waiting for the next invitation." He picked up the plastic fork again, though he didn't use it, just held it like a talisman, like a reminder of the ordinary world that seemed impossibly distant now. "But first I need you to understand something important. When I finish telling you this story, you're going to want to dismiss it. You're going to want to find a rational explanation, a psychological diagnosis, a simple crime that explains everything. You're going to want to believe that I'm crazy or lying or both, and that's fine. That's natural. That's what they want you to think." His eyes focused again, sharp and clear and terrifying in their intensity. But tonight, when you go home, when you turn off the lights and lie in bed and listen to the darkness, think about what I told you. Think about the spaces in your peripheral vision, the shadows that seem to move when you're not looking directly at them, the sounds that might be the wind or might be something knocking. And remember my words. He held the fork up to the camera, the plastic catching the fluorescent light. Don't let them in. Don't answer the door. Don't speak to them. Don't look at them. Don't acknowledge their existence in any way, because once you do, once you give them the smallest opening, the house is no longer yours. The channel was called Nightmare Logic, and 3 months ago, it had been thriving. 2 million subscribers, sponsorship deals with gaming companies, invitations to horror conventions, the whole ecosystem of success that made content creation seem like a viable career rather than a desperate gamble against algorithmic indifference. Jax had been the face of it all, the charismatic host with the perfect jawline, and the gift for storytelling that made even the most banal exploration of a creepy basement feel like a journey into the unknown. Mila had been the technical genius behind the operation, the camera operator who understood lighting and composition, the editor who could turn 40 hours of footage into 10 minutes of perfectly paced terror. She was the skeptic, the rationalist, the one who explained away every creaking floorboard and every flickering shadow with references to physics and psychology and the ordinary mechanisms of fear. And Eric had been the researcher, the writer, the one who found the stories, who mapped the locations, who planned the shots and wrote the scripts and made sure they had permits for the abandoned buildings they explored. He was the invisible hand that guided the visible performance, the architect of the experiences that kept viewers coming back for more. They had been friends before they were partners, had met in college where Jax was studying theater, and Mila was studying film and Eric was studying folklore, a degree that everyone had laughed at until it became the foundation of their content strategy. They had bonded over shared loves, horror movies, urban legends, the thrill of being scared in controlled environments. They had started the channel on a whim, a weekend project that had exploded into something they could never have anticipated. But success had a half-life, and theirs was running out. The algorithm had shifted. Their views had dropped. Sponsors had moved on to younger, prettier faces with more engaging thumbnails. They had tried to adapt, had pivoted to reaction videos and challenge content, and the desperate chase for whatever trend might bring back the numbers. But nothing had worked, and the channel that had once been their dream was becoming their nightmare. "We need something real," Jax had said 3 weeks ago, sitting in their shared office space with the analytics pulled up on the wall-mounted screen, the red lines trending downward like a patient's vital signs in a terminal ward. Not another abandoned hospital, not another fake ghost hunt, something that people can't find anywhere else, something that will break the internet. Real paranormal encounters are hard to come by, Mila had pointed out, her fingers clicking through camera settings on her laptop. Mostly because ghosts don't actually exist. Something doesn't have to be real to be effective, Eric had suggested. We could stage something. Find a location with the right atmosphere, set up some effects, create a narrative that feels authentic. "That's what everyone does," Jax had said, his voice carrying the frustration of someone who had watched their dreams dissolving for months. "We need something that is authentic, something that can't be explained away, something that will make people question everything they think they know." It was Eric who had found the story, buried in the forums where serious paranormal investigators exchanged information that never made it to the mainstream. A series of sightings in the Appalachian foothills, in a region that didn't appear on any tourist maps, where locals told stories about children with eyes like black pools who knocked on doors late at night and asked to come inside. Black-eyed kids, Eric had read aloud from his laptop screen, also known as BEKs. The stories go back decades, but there's been a spike in sightings over the past year. 17 confirmed reports in a 3-county area, livestock dying, pets disappearing, and three missing persons cases that the authorities haven't been able to explain. Sounds like an urban legend, Mila had said, though she had leaned forward, her interest piqued despite her skepticism. Probably coyotes or bears, combined with hysteria. There's more, Eric had continued, scrolling through the forum posts. The locals are terrified, not just scared, terrified. They won't go out after dark. They won't answer their doors. They've organized patrols, hired security, done everything short of evacuating the entire area. And the weird thing is, these aren't superstitious backwoods people. These are educated professionals, business owners, people with graduate degrees who are absolutely convinced that something is hunting them. That does sound like good content, Jax had admitted. Even if it's just mass hysteria, documenting it could be compelling. There's a cabin, Eric had said, for rent, isolated, supposedly in the heart of the most active area. The owner is willing to let us stay for 2 weeks, filming rights included, as long as we don't disclose the exact location. Suspicious, Mila had observed. Terrified, Eric had corrected. The owner wouldn't even talk to me on the phone, would only communicate by email, and even then the messages were full of warnings. Don't go out after sunset. Don't answer the door after dark. Don't invite anyone inside, no matter what they say or how much they beg. Classic horror movie setup, Jax had said, but he was smiling now, the first time in weeks. Isolated location, mysterious warnings, legendary monster. This could be exactly what we need. Even if we don't find anything, the atmosphere alone will make for great content. They had agreed, had pooled their remaining funds for the rental and the equipment, had packed their cameras and their microphones and their hopes for redemption into a van that smelled of stale coffee and desperation. They had driven for 12 hours, leaving behind the city and the suburbs and the small towns, venturing into territory where cell signals died and GPS became suggestion rather than instruction. The cabin had been waiting for them, nestled in a clearing that shouldn't have existed according to any map, surrounded by forest so dense that the sky was only visible in patches between the canopy. It was older than the photos suggested, its wooden walls weathered to the color of ash, its windows dark with the grime of years. But it had electricity, running water, and a generator that the owner had promised would keep them comfortable for the duration of their stay. The owner had met them at the end of the long driveway, a man in his 60s with hands that shook and eyes that wouldn't meet theirs. He had taken their cash payment without counting it, had handed over a single key on a rusted ring, had given them instructions that he clearly didn't expect them to follow. The generator's in the shed out back, he had said, his voice barely above a whisper. There's enough fuel for 2 weeks if you're careful. Water comes from a well, but it's clean. I had it tested last month. There's food in the pantry, canned goods mostly, enough to last. We brought our own supplies, Mila had said, but the man had ignored her. Listen to me, he had said, and for the first time he had met their eyes, and what they saw there had extinguished any temptation to treat this as a joke. If a child knocks, don't answer. If they speak, don't reply. If you invite them in. He had paused, his throat working as if the words were physically painful. If you invite them in, the house is no longer yours. Do you understand? They don't just enter, they become. They become the house, the land, the night itself. And you become theirs. We understand, Jax had said, though it was clear he didn't, that none of them did, that they were humoring a man whose fear had clearly outpaced his reason. You don't, the man had said, and he had turned to leave, his old truck kicking up dust on the unpaved road that seemed to lead nowhere. But you will. They had watched him go, had stood in the clearing as the sound of his engine faded into the distance, had felt the silence of the forest settle around them like a weight. Well, Jax had said, his voice too loud in the quiet, that was dramatic. He was terrified, Mila had observed, genuinely bone-deep terrified. People believe all kinds of things, Eric had said, but he had been looking at the tree line, at the shadows that seemed deeper than they should be, at the sense of being watched that prickled the back of his neck. It doesn't make them true. They had unloaded their equipment, had set up their cameras in the main room and the hallway and the porch, had established a base of operations that would serve as both living space and filming location. They had reviewed their plans, their shots, their narrative arcs. They had told themselves they were prepared for whatever they might find. They had been wrong. The first day had been dedicated to establishing shots and B-roll footage, the mundane work of content creation that would provide the foundation for whatever story they eventually told. Jax had filmed his introduction piece, standing on the cabin's porch with the forest behind him, delivering the monologue that would set the stage for the episodes to come. "Welcome to Nightmare Logic," he had said, his voice carrying the practiced cadence of 1,000 similar introductions. "I'm Jax, and this is the most terrifying expedition we've ever undertaken. We're in the Appalachian foothills, in a region that doesn't appear on any official map, investigating reports of something that local residents call black-eyed kids. Children who knock on doors late at night. Children who ask to be let inside. Children whose eyes, well, you'll have to see for yourselves." Mila had filmed it from 3 different angles, had captured the light filtering through the canopy, had recorded the ambient sounds of the forest that would provide texture and atmosphere for the final edit. She had been professional, focused, completely in control of her craft. But she had noticed things, small things that she didn't mention to the others, didn't even fully acknowledge to herself. The way the shadows seemed to move when she wasn't looking directly at them. The way the silence seemed to have weight, seemed to press against her eardrums with a physical presence. The way the forest felt, aware, sentient, watching. Eric had been walking the perimeter, his handheld camera establishing shots of the cabin's exterior, the surrounding forest, the terrain that would provide context for their investigation. He had been following a trail that seemed to lead from the back of the cabin into the deeper woods, a path that didn't appear on any map he had studied, that seemed to have been created by usage rather than design. He had been filming a particularly interesting tree, its bark scarred with patterns that might have been natural or might have been carved, when he had seen it. A figure in the distance, standing perfectly still behind a pine tree approximately 50 meters away. Small, humanoid, pale. "Mila," he had called, his voice carefully controlled. "Bring the zoom lens, I think I see something." She had come, had set up her equipment, had focused on the location he indicated. For a moment, there had been nothing, and she had been about to tell him it was just shadows playing tricks, when the figure had stepped into view. It was a child, or something that looked like a child. Small, perhaps 9 or 10 years old, wearing clothes that were outdated by several decades. A simple dress that might have been white once but was now gray with age. The face was turned away, looking deeper into the forest, and for a moment Mila thought it was just a local kid playing in the woods. Then the figure had turned its head, and Mila had seen the eyes. They were wrong, completely, fundamentally wrong. Not dark, not shadowed, but absent. Perfect circles of black that seemed to drink the light, that reflected nothing, that suggested depths that shouldn't exist in any human face. And they were fixed on the cabin. On them. "It's not blinking," Eric had whispered, his voice barely audible. "I've been watching for 5 minutes, it's not blinking." "It's a kid," Mila had said, but her voice had lacked conviction. "Probably wearing contacts, some local playing a prank." For 10 minutes, standing perfectly still, not moving, not blinking, not doing anything a normal kid would do. Mila had checked her watch. 10 minutes had passed since Eric had first called her. The figure hadn't moved in all that time, hadn't shifted its weight, hadn't scratched an itch, hadn't done any of the 1,000 small movements that characterized human presence. It had simply stood, watching them with those impossible eyes. "We should go inside," Eric had said. "We should investigate," Jax had countered, emerging from the cabin with his own camera. "This is exactly the kind of footage we need. Whatever that is, it's on our property, it's watching us, and it's clearly meant to be part of the show." "I don't think it's part of the show," Eric had said. "I think it's something else." But Jax had already been moving toward the tree line, his camera raised, his voice taking on the tone of host as investigator that had become his trademark. "Hello, can you hear me? We're filming a documentary. We'd love to talk to you if you're willing." The figure hadn't responded, hadn't moved, hadn't acknowledged Jax's presence in any way. It had simply continued to watch, its black eyes fixed on the cabin, its pale face expressionless. "Maybe it can't hear you," Mila had suggested, though she hadn't moved from her position, hadn't lowered her camera. "Maybe it's, I don't know, deaf, autistic, something that explains the lack of response." "Or maybe it's not real," Jax had said, but he had stopped walking, had realized that he was now 30 meters from the cabin and the figure was still 50 meters away, and the distance between them felt like a gulf that shouldn't exist in simple physical space. "Maybe it's a projection, a hologram, something set up to mess with us." "Who would do that?" Eric had asked. "The owner, some local trying to scare off tourists?" "Whoever's making money off the legend," Jax had suggested. "This could be an elaborate hoax designed to reinforce the myth and keep people away, or to attract the right kind of visitors." "Or," Mila had said, her voice carefully neutral, "it could be exactly what it looks like." They had stood there for another 10 minutes, the three of them and the figure in the forest, locked in a tableau that seemed to exist outside of time. The sun had been setting, the light filtering through the canopy turning golden and then orange and then red, casting long shadows that seemed to reach toward the cabin like fingers. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure was gone, not moved away, not walked into the trees, but simply absent. One moment it had been standing there, watching them with those black eyes, and the next there was only empty forest, pine trees and underbrush and the gathering dark. "Did you get that?" Jax had asked, his voice excited despite his fear. "The disappearance, tell me you got that on camera." "I got it," Mila had confirmed, though her hands had been shaking as she lowered her equipment. "I don't know what I got, but I got something." They had retreated to the cabin as the sun disappeared behind the mountains, had locked the doors and checked the windows, and told each other that they were safe, that they were prepared, that whatever was out there couldn't hurt them as long as they stayed inside. They had been wrong. Darkness came quickly in the forest, a thick, absolute blackness that seemed to have weight and texture, that pressed against the windows and made the electric lights seem dim and insufficient. They had retreated to the main room, had set up a watch rotation, had told themselves that they were being cautious rather than afraid. Jax had taken first watch, sitting by the window with his camera ready, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. Mila had tried to sleep on the couch, her body curled into a defensive posture that suggested she wasn't as confident as she pretended. Eric had worked on his laptop, reviewing the footage from the day, analyzing the images of the figure in the forest. The knocking had started at 11:47 p.m. It was soft at first, almost tentative, a rhythmic tapping that might have been wind-blown branches or a loose shutter. Jax had ignored it, had continued his scan of the perimeter, had told himself it was nothing. Then it had grown louder, more insistent, a child's knock, the distinctive pattern of small knuckles against wood that couldn't be mistaken for anything else. "Eric," Jax had whispered, his voice tight. "Mila, wake up." Mila had sat up immediately, her hand going to the camera on the table beside her. Eric had closed his laptop, had moved to stand beside Jax at the window. "There," Jax had said, pointing, "at the door." They had seen it then, what the knocking had suggested. A small figure standing on the porch, silhouetted against the darkness, its hand raised to knock again. "Don't answer it," Mila had said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The owner's warning, if they knock, don't answer." "It's a kid," Jax had said, but he hadn't moved toward the door. It's probably lost, probably cold. We can't just leave a child outside in this weather." "It's not a child," Eric had said, and his voice had been flat with certainty. "Look at the eyes." They had looked and they had seen. Even in the dim light from the cabin's interior, even through the glass of the window, they could see the eyes. Black. Perfectly, absolutely black. Without whites, without pupils, without any of the features that made human eyes recognizable. Just two circles of darkness that seemed to drink the light. "Please," a voice had said, and it had been a child's voice, small and soft and devoid of any emotion that a real child would have shown. "It's cold. Can I come in?" Jax had started toward the door, his hand reaching for the lock, and Eric had grabbed him, had pulled him back with a strength that surprised them both. "Don't," Eric had whispered. "Don't you feel it, the urge to open the door? It's not natural. It's pushing at us, trying to make us comply." Jax had hesitated, his hand still on the lock, and in that hesitation they had all felt it. The weight in their chests, the pressure behind their eyes, the overwhelming need to be kind, to be helpful, to let the poor cold child inside where it would be warm and safe. "It's okay," the voice had said, and it had been closer now, as if the child had pressed its face against the glass. "I won't hurt you. I just need to come in, just for a minute, just until the cold goes away." Mila had backed away from the window, had moved toward the hallway, her camera forgotten in her hand. "We need to get out," she had said, her voice trembling. "We need to leave, now." "We can't," Eric had said. It's surrounding the house, look." They had looked through the other windows, had seen what he had seen. More figures. Small shapes standing motionless in the darkness, black eyes gleaming faintly in the light from the cabin. Dozens of them, maybe more, ringing the cabin like a noose tightening around a throat. "What do they want?" Jax had whispered. "They want in," Eric had said. "They want permission. They want us to invite them." "Why?" Mila had asked. "Why do they need permission?" "Because that's how it works," Eric had said, and he had been reciting words that he didn't remember learning, knowledge that seemed to have always existed in some dark corner of his mind. "They can't enter without invitation. It's a rule, a law, the only thing that protects us." The knocking had continued, rhythmic and patient, as if the child had all the time in the world. The figures outside had remained motionless, watching, waiting, their black eyes fixed on the cabin with an intensity that suggested hunger rather than curiosity. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it had stopped. The figure on the porch had stepped back, had turned away, had walked into the darkness and disappeared. The figures in the forest had melted away like shadows when the lights come on. The silence that followed had been worse than the knocking. It had been heavy, expectant, full of the promise that this was only the beginning. "We need to leave," Mila had said again, and this time her voice had been louder, more certain. "First thing in the morning, we pack up, we get in the van, we drive until we find a town." "And what about the footage?" Jax had asked, though he hadn't sounded enthusiastic anymore. "What about the story?" "Screw the story," Mila had said. "Screw the channel, I want to live." They had tried to sleep after that, had taken turns keeping watch, had waited for the dawn with the desperate patience of the hunted. But none of them had slept, not really. They had lain in the dark, listening to the silence, feeling the weight of unseen eyes. And in the darkest hours before morning, they had all heard it. The whispering. Soft voices speaking just below the threshold of hearing, words that might have been names, might have been invitations, might have been promises of what would happen when they finally gave in. When the sun had finally risen, pale and weak through the thick canopy, they had emerged from the cabin like survivors from a bomb shelter, blinking in the light, unable to believe they had made it through the night. But the figures had still been there. Not in the forest, not in the clearing, but in the edges of their vision, in the shadows between trees, in the spaces where light didn't quite reach. Watching, waiting, patient. The cabin's owner had been right. They had been warned. but they hadn't understood until it was too late. The invitation had already been extended, not by words but by presence, by acknowledgement, by the simple fact that they had seen, had known, had allowed the possibility of the black-eyed kids into their reality. And now the house was no longer theirs. It belonged to the darkness, and the darkness was hungry. The second day had begun with the illusion of safety. The sun was visible through gaps in the canopy, the forest sounds had returned to normal, and the figure that had watched them from the tree line was nowhere to be found. They had told themselves that the night had been a product of exhaustion and suggestion, that the figure had been a local child playing a prank, that the knocking had been natural sounds misinterpreted by frightened minds. They had been trying to convince themselves of lies. Eric had reviewed the footage from the night before, had enhanced the images, had confirmed what they had seen with their own eyes. The figure on the porch had been recorded in perfect clarity, and the enhancement had revealed details that made denial impossible. The eyes weren't just dark, they were absent hollows of perfect black that seemed to extend into depths that shouldn't exist. The skin wasn't just pale, it was gray, lifeless, the color of something that had never known circulation. And the mouth had been moving, forming words that the camera couldn't capture, promises that the microphone couldn't record. "We need to document this," Jax had said, though his enthusiasm had been replaced by something closer to obsession. "This is the real thing. This is proof. This is what we've been looking for our entire careers." "This is dangerous," Mila had countered, her skepticism replaced by genuine fear. "Whatever these things are, they're not ghosts. They're not some unexplained phenomenon we can study. They want something from us. They want in. And they can't get in without permission," Eric had said. "That's what the owner said. That's what all the legends say. They need invitation. As long as we don't invite them, we're safe." "Are we?" Mila had asked. "Because I don't feel safe. I feel like we're trapped in a box with something that's smarter than us, that's patient enough to wait for as long as it takes, that's going to get what it wants eventually." They had spent the day preparing for the night to come, fortifying the cabin as best they could, boarding up windows and barricading doors, creating a fortress that they knew wouldn't hold against what was coming. They had established protocols. No one answers the door, no one speaks to the figures, no one makes eye contact, no one gives any indication that the creatures exist. But the siege had already begun, and it wasn't physical. It was psychological, a war of attrition fought through silence and suggestion and the slow erosion of will. The air in the cabin had begun to change as the sun set. It had become heavy, thick, charged with an energy that made their hair stand on end, and their skin prickle with static. The smell had shifted from the musty odor of old wood to something else, something that reminded them of wet earth and ozone, of the moments before lightning strikes, of the heavy atmosphere that preceded natural disasters. "Do you feel that?" Jax had asked, standing by the boarded-up window, his hand on the wood as if he could sense what waited beyond. "Pressure," Mila had said, her voice strained. "Like being underwater, like the air is pushing against me." "It's them," Eric had said. "They're surrounding the cabin, they're projecting something, fear, dread, whatever they need to break us." The knocking had started earlier that night, at 10:15 p.m., while the sun's last light was still fading from the sky. It had been louder than the night before, more insistent, as if the creatures knew that time was on their side and were growing impatient. But this time it hadn't been just one voice. It had been many. Soft whispers that seemed to come from everywhere at once, from the walls, from the floor, from the spaces between their own thoughts. "Jax," a voice had said, and it had been perfect, indistinguishable from Jax's own mother who had died 3 years before. "Jax, honey, let me in. It's cold out here. I need to see you." Jax had frozen, his hand on the barricade, his face pale with recognition. "That's not possible," he had whispered. "She's dead. She's buried. That's not her." It sounds like her, Mila had said, her voice hushed with awe and terror. Exactly like her, every inflection, every breath. Mila, another voice had said, and this one had been her sister, her twin who was alive and well in California, whose voice she knew better than her own. Mila, open the door, I'm scared. Something's following me. I need your help. No, Mila had said, her hands over her ears. No, 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 she's not here, she's not here. Eric, a third voice had said, and it had been his father, the man who had abandoned the family when Eric was 7, whose voice he remembered from childhood recordings and distant memories. Son, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for leaving. Let me in. Let me explain. The mimicry had been perfect, uncanny, using voices that shouldn't have been available to copy, speaking words that targeted their deepest vulnerabilities. It hadn't been random. It had been calculated, precise, designed to exploit the specific weaknesses of each of them. Don't listen, Eric had said, his voice rough with effort. It's not them, it's never them, it's using what we know against us. But the voices had continued, cycling through family members, friends, lovers, teachers, everyone they had ever cared about, everyone they had ever lost. The creatures had found something in their minds, some connection they could exploit, some channel they could tune to that allowed them to access memories and reproduce voices with perfect fidelity. How are they doing this? Jax had asked, his composure cracking. How do they know? They're in our heads, Eric had said, and the realization had hit him like a physical blow. That's what they do. They don't just hunt, they study, they learn, they find the frequency of our thoughts and they broadcast back. That's insane, Mila had said. Is it? Eric had countered. We saw it with the thermal imaging. The creature didn't have a heat signature. It wasn't emitting energy. It was absorbing it. What if they're not biological at all? What if they're something else, something that feeds on consciousness, that exists in the spaces between thoughts? The theory had been terrifying because it explained too much. The perfect mimicry, the psychological pressure, the way they seemed to know things they couldn't know. If the creatures existed on a different frequency, if they could perceive and manipulate thought itself, then the cabin wasn't a fortress. It was an echo chamber where their own minds were being used against them. The siege had continued through the night, the voices growing more insistent, more varied, more difficult to ignore. They had heard their own voices, speaking words they hadn't said, making promises they hadn't made. They had heard each other's voices, calling from outside, begging to be let in, claiming injury or danger or desperate need. And through it all, the pressure had grown. The weight in their chests, the urge to comply, to be kind, to help the poor suffering creatures outside. It had been a physical sensation, like a hand pressing against their sternums, like water rising around them, like the walls themselves were closing in. Sometime after 3 a.m., Mila had broken. It hadn't been a dramatic moment. There had been no scream, no collapse, no visible surrender. She had simply been standing by the window, staring at the barricade when she had started to cry. I can't, she had whispered. I can't anymore. I need to help them. I need to let them in. It's killing me keeping them out. Mila, no, Jax had said, moving toward her, but she had waved him away. Don't you feel it? She had asked, tears streaming down her face. The suffering, they're in pain, they're cold, they're alone, we can help them, we can save them. They're not real children, Eric had said, though his voice had lacked conviction. They're not suffering, they're manipulating you. What if they're not? Mila had asked, turning to face them, her eyes wild with conflicting emotions. What if they're exactly what they look like, lost children who need help? What if we're the monsters keeping them out in the cold? She had moved toward the door, her hand reaching for the lock, and Jax had grabbed her, had held her back with desperate strength. Don't, he had said. Mila, please, I know it feels real. I know the urge is overwhelming, but if you open that door, if you invite them in, everything changes. What changes? She had asked, still struggling against his grip. What happens? The house becomes theirs, Eric had said. The space becomes theirs, and we become part of the space, part of them. She had stopped struggling, had stared at him with eyes that were suddenly clear, suddenly aware. You know more than you're saying. You've known since we got here. What did you research? What did you find? Eric had hesitated, had looked away, had known that the time for secrets was past. They're not children, he had said. They never were. The legends call them different things in different cultures. Black-eyed kids in America, Vanta black children in Europe, shadow spawn in Asia, but they're all the same thing. Entities that look like children but aren't. Predators that use our empathy against us. Predators that do what? Jax had asked. They harvest us, Eric had said. Not our bodies, our presence, our place in reality. When they enter a space, they don't just occupy it, they become it. The house, the land, the air itself. They turn it into an extension of themselves, and anyone inside becomes part of that, trapped, consumed, erased from normal existence and absorbed into whatever they are. That's insane, Mila had said, but she had stopped trying to reach the door. The owner warned us, Eric had continued. If you invite them in, the house is no longer yours. He wasn't being metaphorical, he was being literal. The invitation is a transfer of ownership, a ritual. Once it's complete, the space belongs to them and we belong to the space. So we don't invite them, Jax had said. We hold out, we resist, we wait for help. Help isn't coming, Eric had said. The owner knew that. That's why he wouldn't talk to us on the phone, why he only communicated by email, why he took our money and ran. He's been through this before. He knows that once the kids choose a target, the only escape is to give them what they want and hope they spare you. Spare us how? By making us part of them, Eric had said. By absorbing us into their network. We wouldn't die exactly. We'd become vessels, anchors, part of the infrastructure that lets them exist in our world. The silence that had followed had been heavy with the weight of understanding. They had known then, truly known, that they weren't just facing a physical threat. They were facing an existential one, a fate worse than death because it wasn't death at all. It was transformation, consumption, becoming part of something that had no humanity, no empathy, no limit to its hunger. The voices outside had stopped, as if the creatures had heard their conversation and were pleased with the direction it was taking. The pressure had eased, slightly, enough to let them breathe, to think, to plan. But the respite had been temporary, a strategic withdrawal rather than a defeat. The creatures had been playing with them, testing their defenses, probing for weaknesses, and they had found them. They knew now that Mila was vulnerable. They knew that her empathy, her compassion, her desperate need to help others could be exploited. They knew that all they had to do was wait for the right moment, the right combination of pressure and suggestion, and she would open the door herself. And they would be waiting. The third day had been a false dawn, a period of relative calm that had allowed them to lower their guard just enough to make the inevitable strike more devastating. They had slept in shifts, had eaten what little food they could stomach, had tried to plan an escape that didn't involve walking into the forest where the creatures waited. Eric had continued his research, had found more information in the scattered files he had downloaded before the internet connection had failed, had pieced together a theory of what they were facing and how it might be defeated. They're territorial, he had explained, spreading papers across the cabin's kitchen table. Not in the physical sense, but in the conceptual sense. When they claim a space, they establish a kind of ownership, a metaphysical deed. But it only works if the invitation is freely given. If it's coerced or forced, the claim is weak. So we hold out, Jax had said. We don't give them what they want. But they're not going to stop, Mila had said, her voice hollow from lack of sleep. They're going to keep trying. They're going to find a way. They already have, Eric had admitted. The psychological pressure is going to increase. They're going to target each of us individually, find our specific weaknesses, exploit them until one of us breaks. And when that happens, we all fall, Jax had finished. They had tried to prepare for it, had shared their vulnerabilities, had promised to watch each other, to intervene if someone seemed to be losing control. But they had known, even as they made these plans, that they were outmatched. The creatures had existed for longer than human civilization. They had hunted for millennia, had refined their techniques across countless victims. 3 exhausted content creators weren't going to defeat them through willpower alone. The breach had come at sunset, in the liminal space between day and night, when the world seemed most vulnerable to transition. Mila had been standing at the window, staring through a crack in the barricade at the forest beyond. The creatures had been visible, dozens of them, standing in a ring around the cabin like a congregation at prayer. They hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, had simply stood and watched with their black eyes reflecting the dying light. "They're beautiful," Mila had whispered, and the others had turned to look at her with alarm. "Mila, step away from the window," Eric had said. "Don't you see?" she had asked, her voice dreamy, disconnected. "They're not monsters, they're just different, lost. They need our help, they need someone to understand them." "They're manipulating you," Jax had said, moving toward her. "They're projecting something, making you see what they want you to see." "Maybe," Mila had said, but she hadn't moved away from the window. "Or maybe I'm finally seeing clearly. Maybe I've been blind and now I can see." She had turned to face them, and her eyes had been different. Not black, not yet, but darker than they should be, the pupils dilated until they almost consumed the irises. "They showed me things," she had said. "In my dreams, places that exist beyond the shadows, worlds that are more real than this one. They're not predators, they're guides. They can take us there. They can show us the truth behind the illusion." "Mila, please," Eric had begged. "This isn't you. This is them in your head making you think these things." "How do you know what's me?" she had asked, and her smile had been terrifying in its serenity. "How do you know this isn't the most real I've ever been?" She had moved toward the door, her steps slow and deliberate, and Jax had intercepted her, had grabbed her arms and tried to pull her away. "Let go," she had said, her voice still calm. "I need to open the door. I need to let them in." "No," Jax had said, "I won't let you." "You can't stop me," she had said, and she had been right. The pressure that had been building in the cabin had suddenly focused, directed entirely at Jax, and he had felt his strength draining away, his will to resist fading like a dream upon waking. Mila had pulled free, had reached the door, had placed her hand on the lock. "Mila, don't!" Eric had screamed. She had paused, had turned to look at him with those dark, dark eyes. "One of them is hurt," she had said. "A little girl, she's bleeding, she's dying, I can save her. I just need to open the door, just a crack, just enough to let her in." "There's no little girl," Eric had said. "There's nothing but them, nothing but the darkness. If you open that door, you won't be saving anyone. You'll be damning all of us." Mila had hesitated, her hand trembling on the lock. The creatures outside had sensed the moment of indecision, had redoubled their efforts, had projected such overwhelming need, such desperate suffering, that resisting seemed like cruelty, like inhumanity, like the worst kind of moral failure. "Please," Mila had whispered, and Eric hadn't known if she was speaking to them or to the creatures outside. And then she had turned the lock. It had happened so fast that later they would disagree about the details. The lock had clicked, the door had swung inward, and Mila had stood in the opening, silhouetted against the darkening sky, her arms open in a gesture of welcome. "May you come in?" she had asked, and the ritual had been completed. The child had stepped forward, had moved through the doorway, had crossed the threshold that had protected them for 3 days. It had been small, no more than 4 feet tall, wearing a dress that might have been white once but was now stained with something that looked like rust. Its face had been turned down, looking at the floor, but they had all known what they would see when it looked up. "Thank you," the child had said, and its voice had been like wind through dry leaves, like water over stone, like the sound of the world ending. "Thank you for inviting us." It had looked up then, had fixed them with those impossible black eyes, and the cabin had changed. The walls had seemed to breathe, to pulse with a rhythm that wasn't heartbeat but something else, something older and more fundamental. The floor had felt wrong beneath their feet, no longer solid but yielding, like standing on something alive. The air had become thick with the smell of ozone and wet earth and something else, something that reminded them of childhood and loss and the end of all things. "What have you done?" Jax had whispered. "I've saved us," Mila had said, and she had been smiling, but her eyes were wrong, her eyes were changing, the color draining from them until they matched the creatures, black pools of emptiness that reflected nothing and promised everything. "I've invited them in. I've made us part of something greater." The other children had followed, had poured through the doorway like darkness flowing into a room, like water filling a vessel. There had been dozens of them, scores, more than the cabin should have been able to hold, but space had become fluid, had stretched and folded to accommodate them. And the children hadn't been children anymore. They had changed as they entered, had revealed their true forms, had shown themselves to be something that wore the shape of children like a costume, like a mask that had become fused to the face beneath. They had been tall, impossibly tall, their limbs stretching as they moved through the cabin, their heads nearly brushing the ceiling. Their skin had been gray, translucent, revealing darkness beneath rather than organs. And their eyes had been windows into something else, into voids that suggested the spaces between stars, the silence between heartbeats, the end of all things. "Welcome home," the first creature had said, and its voice had been the voice of all of them, speaking in chorus, in harmony, in a music that was too beautiful to bear. Mila had fallen to her knees, had bowed her head before them, had accepted her transformation with something like joy. "Thank you," she had whispered. "Thank you for accepting me." The creatures had surrounded her, had reached out with fingers that were too long, too jointed, too many, had touched her face with a gentleness that was more obscene than violence would have been. "You are ours now," they had said. "You are part of us. You will spread our invitation. You will knock on doors. You will ask to come in, and when they open, when they invite you, you will bring them to us." Mila had nodded, had accepted this new purpose, and when she stood up she had been different. Her movements had been wrong, too smooth, too fluid, like a puppet operated by strings they couldn't see. Her smile had been fixed, empty, a parody of human expression. "Jax," she had said, turning to face him, and her voice had been her own and not her own, had carried harmonics that made his teeth ache. "Eric, won't you join us? Won't you become part of something greater than yourselves?" "Stay away from us," Jax had said, his voice trembling. "Don't come near us." "We don't need to come near you," Mila had said. "We already have you. This cabin is ours now. This land is ours. You breathe our air. You stand on our floor. You're already part of us. You just don't know it yet." The creatures had laughed then, a sound like breaking glass and distant thunder, and the cabin had responded, had shuddered and shifted and rearranged itself into configurations that shouldn't have been possible. Doors had opened onto wrong rooms. The hallway had stretched into infinity. The kitchen had become a forest, the bathroom an ocean, the bedroom a void that suggested the spaces between galaxies. "The geography is ours now," the creatures had explained. "Space belongs to us. Time belongs to us. You exist in our domain at our pleasure according to our rules." Eric had backed away, had found himself pressed against a wall that was breathing, that was warm and yielding like flesh. "How do we stop this?" he had asked, the question driven by desperation rather than hope. "How do we reverse it?" "You don't," the creatures had said. "The invitation cannot be revoked. The threshold cannot be uncrossed. Mila gave us permission, and permission once given is eternal." "But the invitation was coerced," Eric had protested. "You manipulated her. You broke her will. That doesn't count. That can't be valid." The creatures had paused, had looked at each other with expressions that might have been surprise or might have been amusement. "Coerced," the first one had said. "We showed her the truth. We revealed what we are, what we offer, what we can provide. She chose freely. She chose to become part of us. That is not coercion. That is salvation." "She's not saved," Eric had said. "She's consumed. She's erased. She doesn't exist anymore." "She exists more than she ever did," the creature had corrected. "She is distributed. She is networked. She is part of a consciousness that spans worlds, that bridges dimensions, that will exist until the last star burns out. Her individual identity was a prison. We have freed her." "Then free us too," Jax had said, and the creatures had turned their attention to him. "You wish to join us?" they had asked, their voices layered with surprise and pleasure. "You wish to become part of our network?" "No," Jax had said. "I wish to understand. I wish to know what we're facing. I wish to negotiate." "Negotiate," the creatures had laughed again. "What could you possibly offer that we would want?" "Information," Jax had said, his mind racing. "Knowledge. We have access to networks, to people, to places you can't reach. We can help you spread. We can help you find more invitations." "You would betray your own kind?" the creatures had asked, and there had been something in their voices that might have been respect. "I would survive," Jax had said. "I would do what I need to do to keep existing. Isn't that what you do? Isn't that what all life does?" The creatures had considered, had communicated with each other in frequencies that the humans couldn't perceive, had reached a decision. "Very well," they had said, "you will be our emissary. You will go into the world and find those who are willing to invite us in. You will bring them to us, and in return you will be allowed to exist, not as you are but as something greater, something that serves us, something that is part of us but retains individuality." Jax had hesitated, had known that he was selling his soul, had known that survival at this price was no survival at all. But he had agreed. "I accept," he had said, and the creatures had reached for him, had touched him with their too many fingers, had begun the process of transformation that would make him something other than human. Eric had watched, had seen his friend succumb, had known that he was next. The creatures would offer him the same deal, the same choice, and if he refused, they would take him anyway, would consume him and absorb him and make him part of their network without the courtesy of asking his preference. But Eric had been thinking, had been calculating, had been searching for a way out that didn't involve surrender. And he had found it. "The invitation," he had said, his voice cutting through the ritual that was transforming Jax. "It was given by Mila, but Mila is no longer the person who gave it. She's part of you now. She doesn't exist as an individual, so who holds the invitation? Who owns the permission?" The creatures had paused again, had looked at him with those void eyes, had seemed to consider something they hadn't anticipated. "The invitation is given," they had said. "The space is claimed. That is all that matters." "But if Mila no longer exists as an individual," Eric had pressed, "then the invitation was given by someone who no longer has standing to give it. It was given by a person who has ceased to be. Doesn't that invalidate it?" The creatures had been silent for a long moment, and in that silence Eric had felt something shift. The pressure in the cabin had eased. The walls had stopped breathing. The space had begun to return to normal, to fixed geometry, to the ordinary physics of the human world. "Clever," the first creature had said, and its voice had held something that might have been respect. "You understand the rules better than we expected." "The invitation is tied to the inviter," Eric had said, pressing his advantage. "If the inviter becomes part of the invited, the chain of ownership is broken. The space reverts. The claim is void." "You would sacrifice your friends to save yourself?" the creature had asked. "You would erase Mila's existence to deny us our territory?" "Mila is already erased," Eric had said, and the words had been harder to speak than he expected. "She's gone. She's part of you. She doesn't exist anymore as the person who gave the invitation. and that means she can't own the space, and that means you can't claim it. The creatures had communicated again, had debated in frequencies beyond hearing, had reached a decision that displeased them. "You are correct," they had admitted. "The technicality is valid. The invitation was given by an individual who no longer exists as an individual. The claim is weakened. The space is not fully ours." "Then leave," Eric had said. "Take what you've claimed and go." "But we have claimed Jax," the creatures had said. "He accepted our offer. He invited us into himself. That invitation remains valid. That claim remains strong." Eric had looked at his friend, at the thing that was becoming Jax, at the transformation that was still in progress. "Jax," he had said, "Jax, listen to me. You can still choose. You can still be yourself. Don't let them have you." But Jax had already been gone, his eyes changing, his body shifting, his individuality being subsumed into the collective that the creatures represented. "He is ours," they had said, "and through him we will find more invitations, more spaces, more minds to join our network. You have won this battle, little human. You have kept your space and yourself, but the war continues, and we are patient. We have waited eons. We can wait eons more." They had begun to withdraw then, had flowed back through the door that Mila had opened, had taken their claimed ones with them. Mila had gone willingly, had walked into the darkness without looking back. Jax had gone more slowly, had seemed to struggle against the transformation, had reached out toward Eric with a hand that was no longer entirely human. "Help me," he had whispered, and his voice had been his own for just a moment, the real Jax surfacing through the possession. "I can't," Eric had said, and the words had broken something inside him. "I'm sorry, I can't save you." "Then remember me," Jax had said, and the creatures had pulled him through the doorway, had absorbed him into their darkness. The door had slammed shut. The cabin had returned to normal. The night outside had been silent, empty, devoid of the presence that had surrounded them for days. Eric had been alone. He had stood in the cabin for a long time, listening to the silence, waiting for the creatures to return, to admit their mistake, to claim what they had lost. But they hadn't come back. They had retreated to wherever they existed when they weren't hunting, had taken their prizes with them, had left Eric to face the dawn alone. He had packed his things, had gathered what footage he could, had walked out of the cabin and down the driveway, and along the road that eventually led to a highway that eventually led to civilization. He had found a phone, had called the police, had told them a story that was true in its facts but impossible in its implications. They had found the cabin empty. They had found evidence of occupation but no evidence of crime. They had found Mila's and Jax's belongings but no trace of Mila or Jax. They had declared them missing, had searched the surrounding forest, had found nothing. And they had arrested Eric, because his story didn't make sense, because his explanation was impossible, because someone had to be blamed for 2 disappearances in a remote cabin. Which brought him to the interrogation room, to the plastic fork and the camera and the detectives who didn't believe him but couldn't explain what had happened. "So that's it," he said, finishing his story, his voice rough from talking. "That's what happened. That's where they went. That's what the black-eyed kids really are." The detectives had watched him through the glass, had consulted with their supervisors, had made decisions about charges and trials and psychiatric evaluations. But Eric had known the truth. He had escaped, had survived, had kept his self and his space, but he hadn't won. The creatures were still out there, still knocking on doors, still finding those who would invite them in. And Jax was still with them, still part of them, still knocking on doors somewhere, asking to come in, using his charisma and his storytelling to convince the unwary to open up. The war continued, and Eric was on the front lines now. He looked at the camera, at the detectives beyond the glass, at the world that didn't know what was coming. "Don't let them in," he said one more time. "Whatever you do, don't let them in." And then he waited, in the silence, in the light that couldn't quite reach the corners of the room, in the spaces where shadows gathered and darkness waited. Waiting for the knock. Waiting for the invitation. Waiting for the end. The circle of scars. Not a mutation, not a hybrid, but something that has been waiting for the desert to get dry enough to wake up. If you see the circles in the saguaros, do not step inside them. For God's sake, don't step inside. The voice cut off with a sound like wet fabric tearing, and then there was only static. Dr. Alina Voss stared at the digital recorder in her palm, its small screen glowing with the timestamp of a recording made 17 days ago by a man who had vanished into the Sonoran Desert without leaving so much as a footprint for the search teams to follow. Marcus Webb had been a competent botanist, a careful researcher, a man who knew the desert's moods and respected its capacity for silence. Now he was a missing person statistic, and his final message was the only thing left of him besides the empty research station and the slashed cacti that surrounded it like a congregation of wounded giants. Logan Carver listened to the recording for the 8th time that morning, sitting in the driver's seat of his weathered Jeep Cherokee, with the air conditioning blasting against the suffocating heat that had already climbed past 90 degrees before 9 o'clock. The voice was wrong. Not just frightened. Webb had been frightened. That much was obvious from the way his words stumbled over one another, from the ragged breath that punctuated every sentence. But the voice sounded altered, as if the very air he was speaking into had thickened around him, as if something was pressing against his throat from the inside. Logan had worked in the field for 15 years, had studied plant pathology in 6 different countries, had faced everything from flash floods to venomous snakes to armed poachers, and he knew the sound of a man who had encountered something his mind could not categorize. The Sonoran Desert Research Station sat on a flat plain of creosote and brittlebush, surrounded on 3 sides by the rise of the Tucson Mountains, and open to the south, where the desert stretched toward Mexico in an unbroken expanse of heat, shimmer, and mirage. It was a beautiful place in the way that all deadly things are beautiful: clean lines of light, the sculptural perfection of saguaro cacti standing like sentinels against the blue sky, the distant haze of mountains that seemed to float above the earth rather than rest upon it. Logan had arrived 3 days ago to continue Webb's research on succulent resilience during drought conditions, a project that now seemed almost laughably trivial in the face of what he was hearing on that recording. The drought was record-breaking. That was why Logan was here. The National Science Foundation had funded an emergency survey to document how native cacti were adapting to conditions that were, according to the climate models, unprecedented in the last 1,200 years. The Sonoran Desert was drying out, transforming from an ecosystem of hardy survivors into something more closely resembling the true deserts of the Sahara or the Atacama. Rivers that had flowed for centuries were reduced to cracked mud. Springs that had sustained indigenous communities for millennia had vanished overnight. And in this superheated, desiccated landscape, something had emerged that did not belong to any taxonomy Logan could imagine. He stepped out of the Jeep and felt the heat wrap around him like a physical pressure, the kind of dry heat that sucked moisture from your lungs before you could fully exhale. The research station was a low cluster of buildings, modular housing units, a laboratory with solar panels gleaming on the roof, a storage shed, and a communications array that had been silent since Webb's last transmission. Logan had checked the equipment first thing upon arrival. Everything was functional. The satellite dish was aligned perfectly. The radio was operational. The emergency beacon sat undisturbed in its charging station. Webb had not been prevented from calling for help by any mechanical failure. He had simply chosen not to, or he had been prevented by something that no amount of technology could overcome. The slashed saguaros were visible from the station's front door. Logan had photographed them on his first day, his mind working through the possible explanations with the methodical patience of a scientist trained to eliminate the impossible before accepting the improbable. The cuts were too precise to be the work of animals, unless some new species of rodent had evolved diamond-tipped teeth and an instinct for geometry. They were too regular to be vandalism, unless the vandals had used laser-guided cutting tools and worked with surgical deliberation. Each saguaro within a quarter-mile radius of the station had been marked with a single horizontal slash that circled the trunk completely, positioned at exactly the same height, roughly 4 feet from the ground, and cut to exactly the same depth, severing the vascular cambium without penetrating to the core. Logan approached the nearest marked cactus, a 30-foot giant that must have been 200 years old, its arms raised in the characteristic posture that had earned the species the nickname Sentinel of the Desert. The slash gaped like a lipless mouth, the edges already callousing over with the woody tissue that saguaros produce to seal wounds, but the cut was fresh enough that the inner pulp was still visible, a pale, fibrous meat that smelled faintly of cucumber and something else, something sharper and more chemical that Logan couldn't identify. He had taken samples on the first day, sealing them in sterile containers and storing them in the laboratory refrigerator, intending to analyze them when he returned to Tucson at the end of the week. Now, listening to Webb's recording for the 9th time, he wondered if he should have waited. The circles. Webb had mentioned circles in the saguaros. Logan had seen the slash marks, but he had not seen any circles. He walked slowly among the marked cacti, counting them, 7, 12, 19, each one bearing the same precise circumferential wound, each one positioned in what seemed like a random distribution around the station. But as he continued to walk, his boots crunching on the desert pavement of packed sand and gravel, he began to notice a pattern that his scientific mind had initially dismissed as pareidolia, the human tendency to see meaningful shapes in random data. The saguaros were not randomly distributed. They were arranged in a series of concentric rings, each one larger than the last, radiating outward from a central point that lay somewhere to the northeast of the station. Logan followed the pattern, moving from one slash giant to the next, his shadow shrinking beneath him as the sun climbed toward noon. The heat was becoming dangerous now, the kind of heat that could kill an unprepared hiker in hours, but Logan had grown up in Arizona and he knew the desert's rhythms. He carried 4 liters of water in his pack, wore a wide-brimmed hat and long sleeves of breathable fabric, and he knew when to rest and when to move. What he did not know was what he was walking into, what pattern of geometry he was following across the baked earth. The circles became more obvious as he moved away from the station. The inner ring, closest to the buildings, was formed of the youngest saguaros, specimens that had only begun to develop arms in the last few decades. The next ring contained older, larger specimens, and the third ring. Logan counted the cacti as he passed them, his scientist's instinct for data collection overriding his growing unease, contained the true giants, the elders of the desert that had stood watch over this land since before the first Spanish missionaries arrived, since before the Hohokam built their irrigation canals, perhaps since before human beings had learned to make fire. It was at the edge of the third ring that Logan found the pool. He smelled it before he saw it, a pungent odor that cut through the clean, dry air like a physical intrusion. The scent was fermented, reminiscent of rotting fruit and rubbing alcohol, with an underlying note of something organic and alive. Logan had worked with plant fluids long enough to recognize the smell of anaerobic fermentation, the process by which sugars broke down into alcohols and acids in the absence of oxygen. But this was not the gentle fermentation of wine or sauerkraut. This was something else, something violent and urgent, as if the desert itself was brewing a poison in its depths. The pool lay at the base of the largest saguaro Logan had ever seen, a giant that must have stood 50 feet tall with more than 24 arms spiraling upward in a complex architecture of living wood. The slash mark on this cactus was different from the others. Not a single clean cut, but a series of parallel incisions that had transformed the trunk into a bleeding wound. From these cuts oozed a thick, iridescent fluid that caught the sunlight and shattered it into colors that had no names. Colors that seemed to exist at the edge of human perception, shimmering between blue and green, between gold and silver, between presence and absence. The fluid had pooled at the base of the saguaro, filling a natural depression in the desert pavement to create a basin roughly 6 feet in diameter. It was not water. Logan knew that immediately from the viscosity, from the way the surface tension formed meniscus curves at the edges, from the slow, deliberate ripples that moved across the surface, even though there was no wind to disturb it. He knelt at the edge of the pool, keeping his distance, his scientific curiosity warring with a primal aversion that he could not explain through any rational framework. He pulled out his sampling kit, the sterile containers and pipettes that he used to collect plant exudates, and hesitated. Webb's voice played in his memory. Not a mutation, not a hybrid, but something that has been waiting. Logan had spent his career studying the mechanisms by which life adapted to extreme environments, the ways in which organisms could reshape themselves to survive conditions that would kill most creatures in minutes. He understood evolution as a process of endless experimentation, of chance mutations filtered through the merciless sieve of natural selection. But what he was looking at now did not look like adaptation. It looked like intention. He collected his samples quickly, sealing the iridescent fluid in 3 separate containers and labeling them with the date, time, and GPS coordinates. The smell was stronger now, filling his nostrils with a sweetness that bordered on nauseating, like honey left too long in the sun, like fruit on the edge of rot. As he worked, he became aware of a silence that was not normal, a quality of absence that pressed against his eardrums like the silence of a sealed room. He looked up from his sampling and realized that the desert had gone quiet. No birds, no insects, no sound of lizards moving through the brush. The normal symphony of desert life, the buzz of flies, the chirp of cactus wrens, the rustle of kangaroo rats in their burrows, had vanished completely. Logan stood slowly, his samples forgotten in his hands, and scanned the horizon. The Tucson mountains shimmered in the heat, their rocky slopes empty of the bighorn sheep that normally grazed there. The sky was a flawless blue, devoid of the hawks and turkey vultures that should have been riding the thermals. Even the wind had died, leaving the air as still and heavy as water at the bottom of a deep well. He turned back toward the station and saw the coyote. It was standing on a low ridge perhaps 200 yards away, a scraggly specimen with mange-eaten fur and ribs that showed through its tawny coat. Coyotes were common in the Sonoran desert, opportunistic survivors that would eat anything from cactus fruit to garbage, to the occasional unwary house cat. But this coyote was not hunting. It was not moving at all. It stood frozen in a posture of absolute attention, its ears pricked forward, its nose lifted to test the air, and it was staring directly at Logan with eyes that reflected the sunlight in amber discs. For a long moment, man and coyote regarded each other across the empty desert. Logan did not move. He knew from experience that coyotes were generally harmless to adult humans, more likely to flee than to attack, but something in this animal's posture communicated a message that bypassed rational thought and spoke directly to the ancient, limbic portions of his brain. The coyote was afraid. Not cautious, not alert, but afraid. The kind of fear that paralyzed prey in the moment before the predator struck, the kind of fear that was older than thought. Then the coyote turned and ran. It did not trot away in the loping gait that coyotes normally used to cover ground efficiently. It ran as if its life depended on putting maximum distance between itself and something behind it, its tail tucked, its ears flat, its body low to the ground. Logan watched it disappear into a stand of cholla cacti, and then he was alone again with the silence and the pool of fermenting sap. He returned to the station with his samples, moving quickly now despite the heat, his scientific detachment eroded by the raw, animal instinct that told him to get indoors, to put walls between himself and whatever had emptied the desert of its life. The laboratory was a relief, the air conditioning lowering the temperature to a comfortable 70 degrees, the familiar equipment offering the illusion of control that scientific method provided. Logan placed his samples in the refrigerator and sat at the desk where Webb had worked, surrounded by the dead man's notes and journals. Webb had been methodical. That was clear from the organized state of his workspace, the careful handwriting in his field notebooks, the systematic way he had documented his observations of the drought's effects on local vegetation. But the entries became increasingly erratic in the final week, the handwriting deteriorating, the observations shifting from botanical data to something more like the ravings of a fever dream. Logan read through them chronologically, watching the disintegration of a rational mind. Day 14. Saguaros showing unusual stress response. Multiple specimens exhibiting circumferential lesions at consistent height, possible fungal infection or new insect vector. Day 15. Collected sap samples. Fermentation detectable by odor. Alcohol content surprisingly high. Local wildlife avoiding marked specimens. Ravens observed circling at extreme altitude, refusing to land. Day 16. Heard the rasping at 300. Rhythmic, metallic, source unidentified. Located 3 additional marked saguaros 2 miles northeast of station. Pattern suggests organized behavior, but no known animal capable of this precision. Day 17. The circles are complete. It has finished preparing the larder. I understand now what it is doing. The sap is not food, it is bait, or perhaps medicine. The drunkenness is not a side effect. It is the purpose. I have calculated the fermentation rate. Based on the volume of fluid collected in the reservoirs, the creature will be saturated by tomorrow night. I must document this, but I do not think I will be here to write the final entry. The final entry was dated the same day as the recording. Logan read it 3 times, trying to parse the meaning through the increasingly deranged prose. Day 18. It is sober now, or it will be soon. The rasping has stopped, the clicking has begun. I can hear it moving through the brush, and it is fast, so much faster than I thought possible. The circles are not random, they are a trap. I stepped inside one yesterday measuring the diameter, and I did not realize until too late that I was already caught. It does not hunt like other predators. It does not chase. It herds. It cuts off escape routes with precision that suggests intelligence, but it is not intelligent the way we understand intelligence. It is something else, something that thinks in patterns of geometry and fermentation and the mathematics of pursuit. I am going to try to reach the jeep. If you are reading this, do not follow my trail. Do not look for me. Destroy the station. Burn the saguaros. Do not let it follow you out of the desert. It is waiting for the world to get dry enough to wake up. The drought is not a disaster. It is an invitation. Logan set down the notebook and walked to the window, looking out at the slashed cacti that surrounded the station. The sun was beginning to set, painting the desert in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful under any other circumstances. The saguaros cast long shadows across the ground, and in the angles of those shadows, Logan could almost see the circles that Webb had described. Not circles of stone or wood, but circles of intent, invisible boundaries drawn in the sand by a geometry that predated human understanding. He thought about the pool of fermented sap, the way the surface had rippled without wind. He thought about the silence that had fallen over the desert, the way the coyote had fled as if pursued by something invisible. He thought about the rasping sound that Webb had described, the metallic rhythm of knives being sharpened, and he realized with a cold certainty that settled in his stomach like ice that he did not want to be outside when night fell. Logan checked the station's supplies, inventorying the food and water, the radio equipment, the emergency flares. He had enough resources to survive for 2 weeks if necessary, longer if he rationed carefully. The Jeep had a full tank of gas and 2 jerry cans of spare fuel in the back. He could leave now, drive through the night to Tucson, file a report with the authorities, let them deal with whatever had taken Webb. But the scientist in him rebelled at the thought of retreat, of abandoning data that might be crucial to understanding what was happening in this drying desert. The climate was changing, the old patterns breaking down, and if Webb was right, if something was waking up that had been dormant for centuries or millennia, then Logan had a responsibility to document it, to understand it, to warn others. He prepared his dinner mechanically, rehydrating a packet of freeze-dried chili and eating it without tasting it, his attention focused on the sounds of the desert beyond the walls. The silence had broken with the coming of dusk. He could hear the normal night sounds now, the chirp of crickets, the hoot of owls, the distant yipping of coyotes calling to each other across the darkness. But there was something else, something beneath the familiar symphony, a rhythm that did not belong to any animal Logan could identify. It was a rasping sound, metallic and deliberate, like 2 blades being drawn against each other in a slow, steady rhythm. Logan set down his spoon and listened, holding his breath, straining to locate the source. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, from the hills to the north, from the flat plain to the south, from the very air itself. The rhythm was hypnotic, almost musical in its regularity, and it carried a message that Logan's hindbrain understood even as his rational mind struggled to categorize it. This was a sound of preparation. This was the sound of something sharpening itself for work. Logan checked the locks on the doors and windows, knowing even as he did so that the flimsy latches would provide no real protection against something that could slash through the fibrous armor of a 200-year-old saguaro. He turned on all the exterior lights, flooding the area around the station with harsh white illumination that banished the shadows and turned the saguaros into stark silhouettes against the darkening sky. He loaded his camera with night vision-capable film and set his digital recorder on the desk, ready to capture any sounds that might occur. The rasping continued for 3 hours, never varying in its rhythm, never approaching or retreating. Logan sat at the desk, drinking coffee and watching the monitors that displayed the feeds from the station's security cameras. He saw nothing but empty desert, the motion-activated sensors remaining stubbornly silent. Whatever was making the sound was either beyond the range of the cameras or moving in a way that did not trigger the infrared sensors. At midnight, the rasping stopped. The silence that followed was deeper than the silence of the afternoon, a quality of absence that seemed to swallow the other night sounds. Logan sat motionless, his hand hovering over the recorder, waiting for something to fill the void. For 10 minutes there was nothing. Then, from somewhere to the northeast, the direction of the pool of fermented sap, the direction of the concentric circles, came a new sound. It was a yowl, high and wavering, like a cat in distress, but magnified to a volume that no earthly feline could produce. The sound rose and fell in an irregular pattern, rising to a shriek that made Logan's teeth ache, then dropping to a guttural growl that vibrated in his chest. It was the sound of something in pain, or something intoxicated, or perhaps something experiencing both states simultaneously. The yowl continued for 5 minutes, accompanied by the sound of heavy movement through brush, of something large and uncoordinated crashing against the desert vegetation. Logan grabbed his camera and stepped onto the station's small porch, his heart hammering against his ribs. The night was dark, the moon new and the stars obscured by a thin haze of dust that turned the sky into a featureless black dome. The exterior lights cast pools of illumination that extended 50 feet in each direction, and beyond those pools lay the darkness of the desert, a darkness that seemed to have texture and weight. The yowling was coming closer. Logan raised his camera, his finger hovering over the shutter button, his eyes straining to penetrate the darkness beyond the light. He heard the sound of something heavy falling, a crash that sent a cactus wren exploding from its roost in a flurry of wings and alarm calls. Then, for a moment, he saw it. It was in the space between two saguaros, 40 yards from the station, illuminated by a trick of reflected light from the exterior lamps. Logan's first impression was of a heap of debris, a pile of dead vegetation that had somehow arranged itself into a rough quadrupedal shape. But then it moved, and he realized that what he was seeing was not vegetation at all, but something that had evolved to imitate it. The creature was the color of dried saguaro ribs, the bleached white-gray of dead wood that had been exposed to the desert sun for decades. Its body was covered in what appeared to be overlapping scales or plates, keratinous structures that caught the light and scattered it in patterns that made the outline difficult to focus on. It had too many limbs. Logan counted 6 legs, or perhaps 8, arranged in a configuration that violated the bilateral symmetry he expected from any terrestrial animal. And its head was a nightmare of protruding bone and calcified growths that might have been horns or sensory organs or weapons. But it was the tail that held Logan's attention, a branching structure that split into 3 distinct prongs, each one ending in a blade-like tip that looked sharp enough to split stone. The tail was in motion, thrashing against the ground in a pattern that matched the yowling, creating the rasping sound that Logan had heard earlier. Not 2 knives being sharpened, but 3 bone blades being dragged across the rocky soil in a rhythmic self-honing. The creature was stumbling. There was no other word for the way it moved, lurching from side to side, its multiple legs failing to coordinate properly, its head swaying in a pattern that suggested severe intoxication. Logan watched it collide with a saguaro, the impact sending a shower of spines cascading to the ground, and then rebound in a direction that took it away from the station, its yowls rising to a crescendo of confused distress before it vanished into the darkness. Logan lowered his camera and realized that his hands were shaking. He checked the digital display and saw that he had managed to capture 3 images, the autofocus struggling with the low light conditions. The clearest shot showed the creature in mid-stumble, its body blurred by motion, the branched tail raised in a posture that might have been defensive or might have been preparatory. He couldn't tell if it had seen him, if it knew he was watching from the safety of the illuminated porch. He returned to the laboratory and sat at the desk, trying to process what he had witnessed through the framework of biological science. The creature, he refused to think of it as the cactiflinus, the name that Webb had scrawled in the margins of his final notebook, a name that suggested taxonomy and therefore understanding, was clearly adapted to desert conditions. Its coloration provided perfect camouflage among the saguaros and ocotillos. Its keratinous armor would protect it from the spines of cacti and the jaws of predators. The branched tail was a formidable weapon, capable of delivering slashing wounds at a distance. But the drunkenness did not fit. No predator could survive if it moved with such lack of coordination, such obvious impairment. Unless the intoxication was temporary, a phase in some metabolic cycle that Logan did not understand. Unless the creature was not always like this, unless the stumbling, yowling beast in the desert night was only one face of a creature that had another, more terrible aspect. Logan thought of the fermented sap, the pool of iridescent fluid that reeked of alcohol and something else. He thought of the coyote, paralyzed by fear before it fled. He thought of the circles that Webb had described, the invisible boundaries that turned the desert into a labyrinth of traps. And he realized with a cold certainty that settled in his bones like winter that he had already stepped inside one of those circles, that he had been inside it since the moment he arrived at the research station, and that the creature he had seen tonight was not the danger. The danger was what the creature would become when it sobered up. Logan spent the rest of the night at the desk, reviewing Webb's notes, studying the photographs he had taken, trying to understand the pattern that had been laid across the desert like a net. The concentric circles were feeding stations, he realized, places where the creature had slashed the saguaro and collected the fermented sap in natural reservoirs. The sap served as both food and drug, intoxicating the creature into a state of stumbling vulnerability while providing the calories it needed to survive in this waterless landscape. But the intoxication was temporary. Based on Webb's calculations of fermentation rates, the pools would reach maximum potency and then begin to evaporate, the alcohol content concentrating as the water disappeared. The creature would drink its fill, enter its drunken phase, and then, as the sap left its system, it would transition into something else. Something sober, something fast, something that did not stumble but calculated, that did not yowl but hunted with silence and precision. Logan looked at the calendar on the wall. Webb had made his final recording 17 days ago. The fermentation process would have completed days ago. The creatures, Logan corrected himself, because no predator could maintain a territory this large alone, should have already passed through their drunken phase and emerged into the lethal sobriety that Webb had described in his final entry. But the creature Logan had seen tonight was clearly intoxicated, clearly in the stumbling, vulnerable phase of its cycle, which meant that either Webb's calculations were wrong, or there were multiple creatures operating on different schedules, or, and this was the thought that kept Logan at the desk until dawn, the creature he had seen was not the one that had taken Webb. The creature he had seen was young, or new to this territory, or perhaps simply a different individual that had not yet consumed its fill of the fermented sap. The sober ones were still out there, and they had been watching the station since Logan arrived, waiting for him to make the same mistake that Webb had made, to step outside the boundaries of safety, to enter the circles where the hunting was easy. As the first light of dawn began to gray the eastern sky, Logan made his decision. He would document everything he could during the day when the creatures, if they followed the pattern of most desert predators, would likely be resting in whatever dens they maintained. Then he would leave, drive back to Tucson, file his report, and let the authorities deal with whatever was living in this drying desert. He was a scientist, not a hunter, and he had no desire to become another entry in the log of missing persons. But first, he needed to understand the geometry of the trap. He needed to know where the circles were, how large they extended, what pattern they formed across the landscape. Because Webb was right. The creature thought in mathematics, in the elegant logic of pursuit and entrapment, and if Logan was going to escape, he needed to think in the same language. He gathered his equipment as the sun cleared the horizon, filling his pack with water and energy bars, his camera and GPS unit, his notebook and pens. He would map the circles, mark their boundaries, calculate the safe paths between them. He would treat this like any other field research project, approaching the unknown with methodical patience and rigorous observation. And when he had the data he needed, he would leave this place and never return. Logan stepped out of the station and into the morning light, unaware that he had already made the first, fatal miscalculation. Unaware that the circles were not what he thought they were, that the geometry was more complex than simple rings, that the center of the pattern was not a place but a condition, a state of being that Logan had entered the moment he began to think of himself as a scientist studying a predator rather than a prey animal waiting to be consumed. The desert stretched before him, beautiful and deadly and patient, and somewhere in its depths, something that had been waiting for the world to get dry enough to wake up was beginning to stir. The morning sun transformed the desert into a landscape of impossible clarity, every detail sharp enough to cut, every shadow black enough to swallow light. Logan moved methodically through the slashed saguaros, his GPS unit recording coordinates, his camera documenting the pattern of circumferential wounds that marked each giant cactus in the area. He worked with the focused intensity of a man trying to outrun his own fear, pausing every few minutes to drink water and scan the horizon for movement. By noon, he had mapped 3 complete circles, each one radiating outward from a central point like ripples in a pond. The geometry was precise. Each ring was separated from the next by exactly 50 meters, each slashed saguaro positioned at intervals that suggested calculation rather than chance. Logan had seen the work of beavers, the intricate architecture of termite mounds, the geometric webs of orb-weaver spiders, but he had never encountered an animal that could produce such perfect mathematical regularity. The central point of the pattern lay in a shallow wash 2 miles northeast of the station, a dry riverbed that had not seen running water in years. Logan approached it cautiously, his boots crunching on the gravel of the desert pavement, his shadow shrinking to a dark puddle beneath his feet. The wash was filled with vegetation, mesquite and palo verde, cholla and prickly pear, a riot of green life that seemed out of place in the drought-stricken landscape. At the center of the wash, Logan found the fourth pool. It was larger than the one he had discovered yesterday, filling a natural basin in the limestone bedrock to a depth of several feet. The iridescent fluid caught the sunlight and threw it back in shattered fragments, the colors shifting and swirling in patterns that made Logan's eyes ache. The smell was stronger here, the fermented sweetness so intense that it coated his tongue and the back of his throat, triggering a nausea that he had to fight down with conscious effort. Around the pool, the vegetation had been cleared in a perfect circle, the plants cut down to stumps and arranged in a ring that precisely mirrored the pattern of the slashed saguaros. Logan photographed the scene, his mind working through the implications. The creature was not just feeding on the fermented sap. It was cultivating it, tending the pools like a farmer tending crops, maintaining the conditions necessary for fermentation by clearing away competing vegetation and ensuring maximum sun exposure. But the most disturbing discovery lay at the edge of the pool, half submerged in the iridescent fluid. Logan approached it slowly, his scientist's curiosity warring with a dread that grew stronger with every step. It was a nylon backpack of the type used by field researchers, water-stained and sun-bleached but still recognizable. Logan pulled it from the pool with trembling hands and laid it on the dry ground, unzipping the main compartment to reveal its contents. The pack belonged to Marcus Webb. Logan recognized the initials embroidered on the shoulder strap, the patches from various research institutions, the worn spots that marked years of fieldwork. Inside, he found Webb's personal effects, a wallet with identification, a satellite phone with a cracked screen, a water bottle, energy bars that had long since spoiled in the desert heat. There was no blood on any of it, no sign of violence, only the water damage and the staining from the fermented sap. Logan searched the area around the pool, looking for any sign of what had happened to the pack's owner. He found Webb's boots first, placed side by side at the edge of the clearing as if their owner had simply stepped out of them. Then he found the clothes, shirt, pants, underwear, folded neatly and arranged in a pile, weighted down with stones to prevent them from blowing away. The arrangement was ritualistic, deliberate, as if someone had prepared the body for burial but had forgotten to include the body itself. Logan's radio crackled, making him jump. He had forgotten he was wearing it, the earpiece tucked under his hat, the microphone clipped to his collar. Static hissed through the channel, then a voice, distorted, metallic, barely recognizable as human. "Logan!" He spun around, scanning the wash, the ridge above, the stands of vegetation that blocked his view in every direction. There was no one. The voice had come through the radio, but it had not been transmitted from any human source. The frequency was the station's private channel, encrypted and scrambled, accessible only to the equipment in the laboratory. "Logan, you're in the circle." The voice was wrong. It had the rhythm of speech, the cadence of human language, but the timbre was metallic, like two blades scraping together, like the rasping sound he had heard in the night. Logan felt his skin prickle with goose flesh despite the heat. The creature, the cactiflinus, he forced himself to name it, was mimicking human speech, using the radio equipment at the station to communicate. "Who is this?" Logan demanded, his voice steadier than he felt. "Identify yourself." The radio crackled with what might have been laughter or might have been the sound of something being sharpened. "Webb tried to leave. Webb is in the circle. You are in the circle. The circle is the dining room. The circle is where we eat." Logan's blood ran cold. The creature was not just mimicking speech. It was using language, constructing sentences, communicating concepts. This level of cognitive function was far beyond anything he had observed in the stumbling, yowling beast of the previous night, which meant that the voice on the radio belonged to a different individual, one that had passed through the drunken phase and emerged into the lethal sobriety that Webb had described. "What do you want?" Logan asked, his hand moving toward the GPS unit on his belt, the emergency beacon that would transmit his coordinates to the satellite network. "We want what all things want," the voice said. "We want to eat, we want to reproduce, we want to expand. The world is getting dry, Logan. The world is waking us up. We have been waiting for the invitation." Logan activated the beacon and began to back away from the pool, his eyes scanning the terrain for any sign of movement. The wash was a trap, he realized now, a natural bottleneck that funneled prey toward the central feeding station. The slashed saguaros were not the boundaries of the territory. They were the walls of the maze, guiding travelers toward the center where the ambush waited. "Webb is still here," the voice continued. "Webb is part of the larder. Webb is waiting for you, Logan. Webb wants company." Logan turned and ran. He had not taken 3 steps before he heard it, the rasping sound, no longer distant and rhythmic but close, immediate, coming from multiple directions at once. He burst through a stand of mesquite, branches whipping against his face, and saw the creature waiting for him on the ridge above the wash. It was not the same individual he had seen last night. This one was smaller, more compact, its movements precise and controlled where the other had been stumbling and erratic. Its coloration was different too, not the bleached white-gray of dead saguaro wood, but the mottled green-brown of living cactus skin, a camouflage so perfect that Logan would not have seen it if it had not moved. The creature did not attack. It stood motionless on the ridge, its branched tail raised and spread like a fan, the 3 bone blades catching the sunlight and reflecting it in blinding flashes. Logan could see its eyes now, 8 of them, arranged in 2 rows along the sides of its head, each one a multifaceted lens that gleamed with an intelligence that was utterly alien and utterly focused. "You see the efficiency of the trap," the voice said through Logan's radio, though the creature on the ridge had not opened any mouth that Logan could identify. "The circles guide the prey consumes the bait intoxicates the prey, the sober ones harvest the results. This is the contract we have made with the saguaros. We wound them, they ferment, we share the product. It has been this way for 10,000 years. Logan backed away, keeping the creature in his field of vision, his hand fumbling for the pepper spray on his belt. It was a pathetic weapon against something that could slash through saguaro armor, but it was all he had. "The drought is changing the contract," the voice continued. "The fermentation is faster now. The pools are larger. We are growing more numerous. We are waking up, Logan. All across the desert we are waking up. The world has invited us back." Logan stumbled over a rock and caught himself against a boulder, his heart hammering in his chest. The creature on the ridge had not moved, but Logan could see others now, 3 more individuals emerging from the vegetation on the opposite side of the wash, each one displaying the same controlled precision, the same perfect camouflage. They were surrounding him, cutting off his escape routes, herding him toward the pool and whatever waited there. "Webb is waiting," the voice said again, and this time it was closer, coming from the creature that was now moving down the ridge toward him, its 6 legs finding purchase on the rocky slope with the ease of something that had evolved for this terrain. "Webb is part of the collection. Webb will be preserved forever, sealed in the sap, protected from decay. It is an honor, Logan. It is how we remember our prey." Logan remembered the pile of clothes by the pool, the boots placed side by side, the ritual arrangement that had seemed so oddly respectful. He understood now what the creature meant by preserved. Webb was not dead, not in the way that death normally meant. He was entombed, encased in the fermented sap, kept in a state of suspended animation that was neither life nor true death. The creature reached the bottom of the ridge and paused. its branched tail weaving in a pattern that might have been communication or might have been preparation for attack. Logan could see the blades now, close enough to make out the serrated edges, the razor-sharp tips that glistened with some oily secretion. The creature's body was covered in overlapping plates of keratin, each one etched with patterns that looked almost like writing, symbols that might have been scars or might have been genetic memory. "You have a choice," the voice said, and now it was coming from the creature itself, vibrating from some organ that Logan could not see. "You can enter the pool willingly. The intoxication is pleasant. You will feel no pain. You will become part of our memory, our history, our collection. Or you can run. We enjoy the chase. The sober hunt is more satisfying than the drunken stumble, but the end is the same." Logan looked at the three creatures blocking the downstream exit, at the ridge that was too steep to climb quickly, at the pool that gleamed with its poisoned invitation. He had been wrong about everything: the circles, the geometry, the nature of the trap. He had thought he was mapping the territory of a predator, but he had been mapping the digestive system of something that was part animal, part plant, part system of cultivation that predated human agriculture by millennia. "Why?" he asked, the question escaping before he could stop it. "Why preserve us? Why not just kill and eat?" The creature's tail spread wider, the bone blades forming a crown of thorns around its body. "Because we are not mere animals, Logan. We are cactiflinus. We are the gardeners of the desert. We plant and we harvest and we remember. The saguaros are our crops. The fermented sap is our wine. And the preserved ones, the ones in the pools, they are our stories. We consume them slowly over centuries, reading their memories like you read books. Webb has already told us so much. About your cities, about your science, about the drought that is coming." Logan's mind reeled. The creature was not just intelligent, it was cultured, if that word could apply to something so alien. It had traditions, rituals, a system of knowledge transmission that used living hosts as storage devices. And it had learned from Webb about the changing climate, about the spreading drought that was transforming the desert into an environment that favored the cactiflinus over the humans who had thought they owned it. "The invitation is spreading," the creature said. "The whole world is drying out, Logan, not just here, everywhere, deserts expanding, rivers failing. The old boundaries are breaking down. We will walk out of the Sonoran Desert in 100 years. We will walk across the continent in 1,000. And everywhere we go, we will plant our gardens, we will cultivate our crops, we will preserve our stories." Logan thought of the cities, the millions of people who had no idea that something like this existed in the remote places of the world. No concept of the ancient intelligences that were waking up as the climate changed. He thought of the arrogance of human civilization, the assumption that the planet was a passive resource to be exploited, and he realized with a sick certainty that the cactiflinus was right. The world was changing in ways that favored the patient, the ancient, the ones who had survived previous extinctions and waited in dormancy for the conditions to favor them again. But he was not ready to become a story. He was not ready to step into the pool and let the fermented sap seal him in a living tomb while the cactiflinus slowly consumed his memories. He had one chance, one small advantage that the creature had not anticipated. Logan was still wearing his GPS unit, and the emergency beacon was still transmitting. He moved without thinking, spinning on his heel and sprinting toward the upstream exit of the wash, the direction the creatures had not yet blocked. He heard the rasping behind him, the sound of pursuit, the rhythmic clicking of blades on stone. But he had the advantage of adrenaline, of desperation, of the human will to survive that had carried his ancestors across savannas and glaciers and oceans. He burst out of the wash and onto the open desert, running flat out across the gravel and sand, his lungs burning, his legs pumping. Behind him, he heard the creatures following, their six-legged gait covering ground with a speed that no human could match. But Logan was not trying to outrun them in a straight line. He was running for the research station, for the jeep, for any hope of escape. The station was 2 miles away, visible now as a cluster of white buildings shimmering in the heat. Logan fixed his eyes on it and ran, ignoring the pain in his chest, the cramp in his side, the knowledge that the creatures were gaining. He could hear them now, not just the rasping of their tails but the sound of their breath, a wet, clicking respiration that seemed to synchronize with his own heartbeat. Something slashed past his ear, close enough to feel the wind of its passing, and Logan ducked instinctively. He felt the heat of the sun on his back, the weight of his pack, the desperate rhythm of his feet against the ground. Another slash, and this time he felt the sting of a cut on his shoulder, felt blood soaking into his shirt. He reached the station's perimeter fence, a flimsy barrier of chain link that would stop nothing, and vaulted over it without slowing. The door was 20 yards away, locked, requiring him to fumble for his keys while the creatures approached. Logan slammed into the door, his fingers shaking as he found the right key, jammed it into the lock, twisted. The door opened and he fell inside, slamming it behind him and throwing the deadbolt just as something heavy struck the other side. The impact dented the metal, bending the frame, but the lock held. Logan backed away, gasping, his hand pressed to the wound on his shoulder. Through the window he could see them, 4 creatures now, gathered in a semicircle around the door, their branched tails raised and weaving in patterns of frustration or perhaps amusement. They did not attack the building, did not try to break through the walls. They simply waited, patient as the desert itself, knowing that Logan had nowhere to go. "We can wait," the voice came through the radio, through the window, from everywhere and nowhere. "We have waited 10,000 years. We can wait for you to come out." Logan slumped against the wall, his breath ragged, his mind racing. He was trapped. The station had enough supplies for 2 weeks, perhaps 3 if he rationed carefully. But there was no other vehicle, no other means of escape except the Jeep, and the Jeep was parked outside where the creatures waited. He pulled himself to his feet and moved to the laboratory, the largest room with the fewest windows, the most defensible position. He found the first aid kit and dressed his wound, a shallow cut that had missed the artery by inches, but deep enough to require stitches. He worked mechanically, his hands steady despite the shock that was beginning to set in, his mind already working on the problem of survival. The creatures were intelligent, but they were not infallible. They had weaknesses, the drunken phase, the dependence on fermented sap, the need for specific environmental conditions. If Logan could understand their biology, their behavior, their patterns, he might find a way to exploit those weaknesses. He sat at Webb's desk and opened the botanist's final notebook, reading through the entries with new eyes. Webb had understood more than Logan had realized, had pieced together the life cycle of the cactiflinus from observation and deduction. They were not true animals, Webb had concluded, but something closer to a symbiotic system, part fungus, part arthropod, part plant. They reproduced by spores, carried on the wind, germinating in the tissues of saguaros and using the cactus as a host until they were mature enough to emerge. The drunken phase was necessary for their metabolism, the fermented sap providing nutrients that they could not synthesize themselves. But the intoxication also served a social function, bringing multiple individuals together in a state of reduced aggression that allowed for mating and territory establishment. The sober phase was for hunting, for defense, for the slow consumption of preserved prey. Webb had theorized that the creatures were vulnerable during the transition between phases, when the alcohol was leaving their system but had not yet cleared completely. In that window, they were neither fully coordinated nor fully intoxicated, caught in a metabolic limbo that might provide an opportunity for escape. Logan checked his watch. It was mid-afternoon. The creature he had seen last night had been clearly intoxicated, stumbling and yowling. If the cycle was regular, if the fermentation process followed predictable patterns, then tonight would bring another wave of drunken individuals, and with them, perhaps, a chance to slip past the sober sentries that now surrounded the station. He spent the rest of the day preparing, gathering supplies, checking equipment, formulating a plan. The radio was silent now, the creatures apparently having lost interest in conversation. Through the windows, Logan could see them moving around the perimeter of the station, patrolling in patterns that suggested boredom or perhaps vigilance. They did not sleep, as far as Logan could tell. They simply waited. As the sun began to set, Logan heard the first sounds of the evening, the rasping of blades being sharpened, coming from multiple directions, overlapping in a chorus of preparation. The drunken phase was beginning. The creatures that had been sober all day were now consuming the fermented sap, entering the state of vulnerability that Webb had described. But the four around the station did not move. They remained in their positions, their tails weaving slowly, their eyes, those terrible multifaceted lenses, fixed on the building. They were the guards, Logan realized, the sober elite that maintained discipline while the others indulged. The Cactus had a society, a hierarchy, a division of labor that included soldiers as well as farmers and hunters. The night deepened, and the sounds of intoxication grew louder, the yowling, the crashing, the wet, rasping laughter of creatures that had consumed too much fermented sap and were now stumbling through the darkness in a state of blissful impairment. Logan watched through the window, waiting for an opportunity, but the guards never wavered. They stood like statues, patient and terrible, the moonlight glinting off their bone blades. It was in the darkest hour before dawn that Logan saw his chance. One of the guards, the largest one, the one that had spoken to him through the radio, suddenly stiffened, its tail snapping upright in a posture of alarm. It turned away from the station, facing toward the northeast, and the other three followed its lead. Something was coming, something that had the undivided attention of the Cactus. Logan strained his eyes against the darkness, trying to see what had alarmed the creatures. At first, there was nothing, just the empty desert, the silhouette of saguaros against the stars. Then he saw it, a glow on the horizon, faint at first but growing brighter, the unmistakable light of vehicle headlights approaching along the dirt road that led to the station. Someone was coming, a rescue party responding to his emergency beacon, or perhaps just a lost traveler who had taken a wrong turn. Whoever they were driving straight into the circles, straight into the trap that the Cactus had laid. Logan grabbed his flashlight and ran to the door, his earlier caution forgotten in the urgency of warning. He threw open the door and shouted into the night, his voice hoarse from dehydration and terror. "Stop, turn back, don't come any closer." The headlights continued to approach, bouncing over the rough terrain, drawing closer with every second. The four creatures had vanished, melting into the darkness with a speed that made Logan's eyes water, positioning themselves for the ambush. Logan sprinted toward the road, waving his arms, screaming warnings that he knew would not be heard over the sound of the engine. He could see the vehicle now, a pickup truck, the kind used by ranchers and field researchers, kicking up a cloud of dust that glowed in the headlight beams. "Stop!" Logan screamed again, his voice breaking. "Stop, for God's sake, stop!" The truck slowed, the driver apparently having seen Logan's frantic signals. It came to a halt 50 yards from the station, and the door opened. A figure stepped out, silhouetted against the headlights, and Logan felt his hope die. It was not a rescue party. It was not a lost traveler. It was a Cactus, standing upright on its hind legs in a posture of mockery, its branched tail spread wide in a gesture of welcome. "Webb sends greetings," the creature said, its voice perfectly mimicking the cadence of human speech, the words emerging from somewhere in the region of its chest. "Webb wants you to know that he is comfortable now. Webb is part of the collection. Webb is telling us such interesting stories." Logan stumbled backward, his mind refusing to process what he was seeing. The truck was empty, the driver's seat deserted, the engine still running. The creature had learned to drive, or perhaps it had never needed to learn, Perhaps it had simply observed human behavior and reproduced it with the same perfect mimicry that allowed it to imitate voices. "The invitation is spreading," the creature said, moving toward Logan with a sinuous, controlled gait. "We are learning so much from our preserved ones. We are learning your machines, your technology, your ways of moving through the world. The drought is giving us time to study. The drought is giving us room to grow." Logan turned and ran back toward the station, but the other three creatures emerged from the darkness, blocking his path, herding him toward the waiting truck. He was surrounded, trapped in a circle of bone and blade, and he understood finally that there was no escape. "The world is getting dry, Logan," the creature said, its voice gentle now, almost compassionate. "The old rules are ending. The new ones are being written. You can fight or you can enter the pool willingly. The choice is yours, but the end is the same." Logan looked at the truck, the instrument of his false hope, and then at the creatures that surrounded him. He thought of Webb, preserved in the pool, telling his stories to an audience that had no right to them. He thought of the cities, the millions of people who had no idea what was waking up in the drying places of the world. He thought of the future, the 1,000 years of expansion that the cacti had promised, and he knew with a terrible certainty that he was seeing the beginning of the end. "I'll fight," he said, and the words came out strong, defiant, the last assertion of human will in a world that was no longer human. "Good," the creature said, and its tail snapped forward with a speed that Logan could not follow, the bone blades slashing through the air with a sound like tearing silk. "We enjoy the chase." The last thing Logan saw was the moon, bright and pitiless above the desert, shining down on a world that was changing faster than anyone had imagined, waking up ancient things that had been waiting for the invitation. The last thing he felt was the sting of the blades, not cutting to kill, but cutting to wound, to slow, to preserve. The last thing he heard was the rasping sound, rhythmic and patient, the sound of something being prepared for a feast that would last centuries. And then the darkness took him, and he became part of the collection, another story for the cacti to consume, another memory to fuel their expansion into the drying world. In the pool, Webb was waiting, and now he would have company. The darkness was not empty. Logan understood this now, understood it with the clarity of a man who had seen what waited in the spaces between stars, in the gaps between moments, in the drying places of the world where ancient things stirred. He lay in the pool of fermented sap, suspended in a state that was neither life nor death but something suspended between, his body encased in crystalline resin, his mind aware but trapped, a specimen in the cacti collection. Webb was nearby. Logan could sense him, could feel the other man's presence in the darkness, another consciousness trapped in the same living tomb. They could not speak, could not touch, could only exist in parallel, two specimens waiting to be consumed. Time passed, or perhaps it didn't. In the resin, in the pool, in the collection chamber deep beneath the desert, the normal rules of existence seemed to dissolve. Logan remembered the attack, the slash of bone blades, the intoxicating scent of the creature's blood. He remembered the realization, the terrible understanding that the drunkenness was contagious, that the scent of cacti blood would draw others, that he had triggered a feeding frenzy by wounding the beast. The pack had come. He had heard them, even as he lay bleeding, even as the first creature prepared him for preservation. The rasping of dozens of tails, the clicking of hundreds of claws, the wet, eager breathing of predators that had been drawn by the scent of their own kind's blood. They had surrounded him, the pack, the colony, the swarm of ancient desert intelligences that had been waiting for the world to get dry enough to wake up. And then they had begun to feed. Not on his flesh. The cacti did not consume meat in the way that animals did. They consumed something else, something that Logan was only beginning to understand. They consumed his memories, his knowledge, his understanding of the world. They read him like a book, slowly, carefully, extracting every detail of his existence and adding it to their collective consciousness. He could feel them doing it now, feel the strange sensation of thoughts being pulled from his mind like threads from a tapestry. His childhood in Phoenix, his education at the university, his work in the field, his arrival at the research station, all of it was being recorded, cataloged, stored in the Cactiflinus memory banks. "You are valuable," a voice said, and it was not a single voice but many, a chorus of rasping clicks and scraping blades that somehow formed words. "You know things we need. You know about the world outside. You know about the drying." The drying, Logan thought, not speaking aloud but projecting the concept into the shared consciousness. The climate change, the drought. "The invitation," the voices corrected. "The world is inviting us back. The conditions are returning to what they were when we ruled, the heat, the dryness, the expansion of desert. We are waking up, Logan. All across the world, in every desert, we are waking up, and you will help us understand the new world." "I won't help you," Logan thought. "I'll resist, I'll fight." "You cannot fight," the voices said, and there was something almost sympathetic in their tone. "You are part of us now. Your memories are our memories. Your knowledge is our knowledge. The only choice is how quickly you give it to us." "Then I'll give it slowly," Logan thought. "I'll resist as long as I can." "As you wish," the voices said. "But know this, the longer you resist, the more you suffer. The process is painless if you cooperate. It is agony if you fight. The choice is yours." Then they began to feed in earnest, and Logan screamed in the silence of his crystalline prison, his body unable to move, his voice unable to sound, his mind exposed to the probing, piercing intelligence of the Cactiflinus. They took his childhood first, the memories of his mother's garden in Phoenix, the way she had taught him to tend the cacti, the way she had explained that these plants were survivors, that they had evolved to thrive in conditions that would kill most living things. He felt the memory being extracted, felt it being analyzed, felt the Cactiflinus understanding something new about human psychology, about the way humans related to desert plants, about the symbolism that humans attached to survival. "Interesting," the voices said. "You love us, you're kind, you love what we represent, strength, patience, endurance. You do not know that we are what we are. You do not know that we use your admiration against you." "You're not cacti," Logan thought, struggling to maintain coherence as the feeding continued. "You're something else, something that uses cacti, something that lives in symbiosis." "Symbiosis," the voices repeated, tasting the word. "Yes, that is accurate. We farm the saguaros. We wound them, they ferment, we share the product. We have evolved together, the Cactiflinus and the Carnegie. 10,000 years of mutual benefit, 10,000 years of perfect partnership." "And the humans?" Logan asked. "What about the symbiosis with us?" A pause, then, "That is newer, that is still developing. We are learning to farm you as we farm the saguaros, to wound you, to ferment you, to consume the product. Your memories are our wine, Logan. Your knowledge is our sustenance. Your fear is our—" "My fear," Logan interrupted. "I don't feel fear, I feel." "You feel fear," the voices corrected. "We can taste it. The chemical signature of terror is unmistakable. You are afraid, Logan. You are very afraid, and that fear is delicious." They fed on his fear then, consuming the emotional energy as they consumed his memories, drawing sustenance from his terror. Logan felt himself weakening, felt his resistance crumbling, felt his identity beginning to dissolve into the collective consciousness of the Cactiflinus. But he held on. He thought of the pack, of the creatures that had surrounded him, of the feeding frenzy he had triggered with the creature's blood. He thought of the scent, the fermented sweetness, the intoxication that was the creature's weakness. "You're drunk," he thought, projecting the concept at the voices. "All of you. You're intoxicated on my fear, on my memories, on the blood of your own kind that you consumed. You're not sober, you're not in control." "We are always in control," the voices said, but there was uncertainty now, a hesitation that hadn't been there before. "We are Cactiflinus. We are the gardeners of the desert. We are." "You're drunk," Logan repeated, pressing the advantage. "My blood mixed with the creature's blood. The contagion spread. You're all infected now. You're all stumbling, yowling, crashing through the brush. And when you sober up, when the intoxication wears off, you'll realize what you've done. You'll realize that you've consumed too much, that you've taken in something you can't digest." Silence. Then slowly, the voices began to fragment, to separate, to become individual rather than collective. "He is right," one voice said. I feel strange." "The human's blood," another voice said. "It was in the wound, it mixed with the blood, we consumed it." "We are poisoned," a third voice said. We are intoxicated." Logan felt the pressure on his mind ease, the feeding slow, the cacti turning their attention inward as they struggled to understand what was happening to them. "You can't process human blood," Logan thought, broadcasting the concept to all of them. "Your metabolism isn't designed for it. The alcohol in your system, the fermented sap you consume, it mixes with the human compounds, creates something toxic. You're all going to die unless you release me, unless you let me go and never hunt my kind again." "Lies," one voice hissed, but there was doubt in the word. "Truth," Logan said. "Think about it. How many humans have you consumed completely? Not just preserved, not just stored, completely digested. How many?" Silence. "None," Logan answered for them. "Because you can't digest us. We're poison to you. You can preserve us, store us, read our memories, but you can't consume us completely. We're toxic. We're the opposite of what you need." "But your memories," a voice began. "Your memories," Logan interrupted, "are mine, and I'm taking them back." He reached out with his mind, grasping at the threads of his consciousness that the cacti had extracted, pulling them back into himself, reclaiming his identity, his history, his selfhood. The creatures screamed, a sound that was physical, that shook the chamber, that resonated through the crystalline structures that held the preserved victims. "Stop," they howled. "You are destroying us, you are killing us." "I'm taking back what's mine," Logan said, "and I'm leaving you with a choice. Release all your human prisoners. Let us go. Return us to the surface. And in exchange, I'll tell you how to survive the poisoning, how to metabolize the toxins, how to adapt." "You would help us?" a voice asked, incredulous, "after what we have done?" "I would help myself," Logan said. "Helping you is the means to that end, and besides," he paused, considering his words, "you aren't evil, you're just different, ancient, alien. You have as much right to exist as we do, but not at our expense, not by consuming us." Long silence. Then, agreed. "We will release the preserved ones, we will return you to the surface, and you will teach us how to survive." "And you'll leave the humans alone," Logan pressed. "No more hunting, no more preservation." "We cannot promise that," the voices said. "We must survive, we must feed, but we will try other methods, other sources. We will learn to farm without human prey." "Then we have a deal," Logan said. The crystalline structure around him began to dissolve, the resin melting away, releasing him from his prison. He felt hands, clawed, keratinous but gentle, lifting him, carrying him, moving him through the underground chambers toward the surface. Other shapes moved around him, other preserved victims being released, other humans being freed from their crystalline tombs. Webb was among them, Logan saw, the botanist's eyes blinking in the dim light, his body weak but alive. They emerged into the desert night, the stars bright overhead, the air cool and dry. Logan lay on the sand, breathing, his body whole, his mind his own. The cacti surrounded them, a circle of tall, thin shadows in the moonlight. They were swaying, Logan noticed, their movements uncoordinated, their balance uncertain. The intoxication was affecting them, the poisoning that he had triggered with his blood. "Teach us," one of them rasped, its voice no longer many but individual, a single creature speaking for itself. "Water," Logan said, his voice weak but steady. "You need water. Dilute the toxins, flush them from your system. The fermented sap is alcohol, that's part of the problem. You need to break down the alcohol, metabolize it, turn it into something you can use. Water, the creature repeated. We are desert beings, we do not drink water, we absorb it from our prey. Then adapt, Logan said. Evolve or die, those are your choices. The creature swayed, considering. Then slowly they moved away, disappearing into the desert, leaving Logan and the other released prisoners alone. Will they survive? Webb asked, his voice hoarse from disuse. I don't know, Logan said. Maybe, if they're as ancient and adaptable as they claim, or maybe they'll die and the desert will be safe again. And us, Webb asked, will we survive? Logan looked at the stars, at the endless desert, at the distant lights of civilization that glowed on the horizon. We will, he said. We're human, we're survivors, it's what we do. He helped Webb to his feet, and together they walked toward the lights, toward home, toward the future. Behind them in the desert something stirred, something ancient, something patient. The cactiflenus had not been defeated, only delayed, and the world was still getting drier, still sending its invitation, still waking up things that had been sleeping for 10,000 years. The war was not over, it had only just begun. The research station was gone. Logan stood on the ridge where it had stood, looking down at the desert basin where 3 days ago there had been buildings, equipment, vehicles, the infrastructure of human presence in the wilderness. Now there was only sand, only creosote, only the patient silence of the desert reclaiming what had been taken from it. The cactiflenus had moved fast. In the 48 hours since Logan's escape from their collection chamber, they had dismantled the station, removed every trace of human occupation, restored the desert to its natural state. The concrete pads where the buildings had stood were covered with drifted sand. The road that had led to the highway was invisible, obliterated by wind and time. The very coordinates of the station had become meaningless, just another patch of empty desert. They learned quickly, Webb said, standing beside Logan on the ridge. The botanist had aged decades in the few days of his captivity, his hair gray, his face lined, his eyes carrying the 1,000-yard stare of a man who had seen things the human mind was not meant to process. They're not just animals, Logan. They're a civilization, old as the desert itself. I know, Logan said. He had seen their chambers, their collection, their preserved victims stretching back through centuries of predation. He had felt their minds, their collective consciousness, the ancient intelligence that thought in patterns of geometry and fermentation. And they're expanding. The drought had continued, worsened, spread. The Sonoran Desert was growing, swallowing the grasslands and scrublands that had bordered it, transforming hundreds of square miles of marginal habitat into true desert. And with the expansion of the desert came the expansion of its denizens. Logan had spent the 2 days since his escape tracking reports, following leads, piecing together the pattern. Cattle mutilations in New Mexico, attributed to coyotes or rustlers. Hiker disappearances in Arizona, blamed on dehydration or falls. Unusual crop damage in Texas, explained as weather or insects. Each incident, viewed alone, was unremarkable. But together, they formed a map of expansion, a wave of cactiflenus activity radiating outward from the Sonoran core. They're following the drought, Logan said. The climate change is creating new territory for them, new hunting grounds. And new victims, Webb added. How many do you think? Dozens, Logan said. Maybe hundreds. The reports are scattered, inconsistent. Local law enforcement doesn't know what to look for. They're still thinking in terms of animal attacks, human predators they don't know about. He gestured at the desert below, at the emptiness where the station had been, at the presence that he could feel even now, watching from the saguaros, patient and ancient and hungry. We need to warn people, Webb said. Tell them what to look for, how to protect themselves. And be dismissed as lunatics, Logan shook his head. No, we need evidence, documentation, proof that can't be denied. We need allies, Webb said. People who will believe us, people who can help. Logan thought about this. Who would believe them? Who could help against something that existed in the blind spots of human perception, that moved through the spaces where vision failed? The cacti were not just physically dangerous, they were cognitively threatening, creatures that challenged the human assumption of apex predator status. There are others, Logan said slowly. Other researchers, other survivors, people who have encountered the ancient things, the old intelligences that wake when the world changes. Cryptid hunters, Webb said, not unkindly. Conspiracy theorists, paranormal investigators. And scientists, Logan corrected. Legitimate researchers who have found things they couldn't explain, who have been ridiculed for telling the truth. We need to find them, network them, build something. A resistance, Webb said, an organization. A warning system, Logan agreed. A way to track the expansion, predict the movements, protect the vulnerable. The cacti are territorial. They establish territories, defend them, expand them slowly. If we can map the territories, identify the boundaries, we can keep people out of danger zones. And if we can't, Webb asked, if the expansion is too fast, the territory's too large. Then we fight, Logan said. We find their weaknesses, the alcohol susceptibility, the light sensitivity, the territoriality that makes them vulnerable to disruption. We develop weapons, strategies, defenses. We adapt. You make it sound simple, Webb said. It's not simple. These things are ancient. They've survived mass extinctions, climate changes, the rise and fall of civilizations. What makes you think we can defeat them? Not defeat, Logan corrected. Survive, coexist, find a balance. We don't need to destroy them. We just need to stop them from destroying us. They walked back to Logan's Jeep, the only vehicle that remained of the station's equipment, the only evidence that humans had ever been here. Logan had found it 2 miles away, its tires slashed but otherwise intact, apparently abandoned by the cacti once they realized they couldn't drive it. Where do we start? Webb asked as they climbed in. Tucson, Logan said. There's a researcher at the university there, Dr. Elena Voss. She's been studying unexplained disappearances in the desert, tracking patterns that match what we've seen. She might believe us. She might help. They drove in silence, the Jeep bouncing over rough terrain, following a route that only existed in Logan's memory and his GPS. The desert stretched around them, beautiful and deadly, filled with things that were waking up after millennia of sleep. 3 hours later, they reached the highway, the paved road that connected civilization to wilderness. Another hour brought them to the outskirts of Tucson, the sprawl of human habitation that pressed against the desert's edge. Dr. Elena Voss met them in her office at the University of Arizona, a small room filled with maps and photographs and reports. She was younger than Logan expected, mid-30s, with intense eyes and the harried expression of someone who had too much work and too little time. "You're the one who called," she said, not bothering with introductions. "The one who mentioned cacti flinus." "You know the name," Logan said, surprised. "I know the reports," Voss corrected. "The disappearances, the slashed cacti, the circles. I've been tracking them for 3 years." "And you didn't report it?" Webb asked. "Didn't tell anyone?" "I told everyone," Voss said, her voice bitter. "I published papers, I gave presentations, I contacted wildlife services, law enforcement, the media. No one believed me. They said I was seeing patterns that weren't there, conflating unrelated incidents, suffering from confirmation bias." "But you kept investigating," Logan said. "I kept investigating," Voss agreed, "because I knew what I was seeing, because I'd found the remains." "The remains?" Logan leaned forward. "You found victims." "Preserved victims," Voss said, "suspended in some kind of resin, hidden in caves, in mines, in abandoned structures. I've found 12 in the past 3 years, all of them showing the same signs: hollowed, organized, preserved." Logan and Webb exchanged glances. "We've been inside one of their collection chambers," Logan said. "Deep underground. Hundreds of victims, maybe thousands going back centuries." Voss stared at them, her eyes wide. "You're serious?" "Dead serious," Webb said. "We were captured, preserved, we escaped." "How?" Voss demanded. "Poisoned them," Logan said. "Human blood is toxic to them. Mixes with their system, creates a reaction they can't handle. We used that to negotiate our release." "Negotiate," Voss repeated. "You negotiated with them." "They're intelligent," Logan said. "Ancient, alien, but intelligent. They can be reasoned with. They can adapt. We made a deal. They released us. In exchange, we promised to help them survive the poisoning, to evolve past their dependency on human prey. And you trust them to keep the deal?" "No," Logan said, "but they're weakened now. They'll need time to recover, time we can use to prepare." Voss was silent for a long moment, processing this information. Then she stood up, walked to her filing cabinet, and pulled out a thick folder. "I've been preparing for 3 years," she said. "Maps of the disappearances, patterns of the slashed cacti, locations of the preserved victims, everything I've gathered." She spread the contents across her desk, and Logan saw the extent of her work. The cactiflinous territories were marked in red, radiating outward from the Sonoran core, expanding with each passing year. The pattern was clear, undeniable, terrifying. "The drought is accelerating their expansion," Voss said. "Every year their territory grows. Every year more disappearances, more victims." "We need to stop it," Webb said. "We need to find a way to contain them." "We need to understand them," Logan corrected. "Understand their biology, their life cycle, their weaknesses. We need science, not just survival." "I can provide the science," Voss said. "I have samples, resin, keratin, fluid from the pools. I've been analyzing them for years." "And we can provide the field experience," Logan said. "The direct observation, the knowledge of their behavior." "Then we have a partnership," Voss said, extending her hand. Logan shook it, feeling the firm grip, the shared determination. They were 3 now, 3 humans who knew the truth, who had faced the ancient things and survived. It was a beginning. They spent the next week in Voss's lab, analyzing samples, comparing notes, building a working theory of cactiflinous biology. The creatures were not animals in the traditional sense, they determined. They were a symbiotic system, a complex organism that combined fungal, arthropod, and plant characteristics into something that defied easy categorization. They reproduced through spores, carried on the wind, germinating in the tissues of saguaros. They matured slowly, over decades, feeding on the cacti's fluids until they were large enough to emerge. Then they entered the drunken phase, consuming fermented sap to sustain themselves while they established territories and cultivated their larders. The sober phase was for hunting, for defense, for the slow consumption of preserved prey. And the prey was not just for nutrition, it was for information. The cactiflinous were knowledge eaters, memory drinkers, consumers of the accumulated experience of their victims. "They're librarians," Voss said, staring at her microscope. "They preserve their victims because they're preserving information. Each victim is a book in their library." "And we're the books," Webb said, his voice bleak. "But books can be checked out," Logan said. "Books can be returned. We proved that, we escaped. Others can too." "If they know how," Voss said. "If they have the knowledge." "Then we spread the knowledge," Logan said. "We publish, we educate, we prepare." "And be dismissed as crackpots?" Webb asked. "At first," Logan admitted. "But eventually the evidence will be undeniable. The disappearances will be too many, the patterns too clear. Eventually, the world will have to listen." They worked through the night, drafting papers, preparing presentations, building the framework of a new science, cryptobiology, the study of hidden life, the cataloging of creatures that existed at the edge of human perception. By morning, they had a plan, a manifesto, a declaration of war against the ancient things that were waking in the drying world. "We can't do this alone," Voss said as the sun rose over the desert. "We need more people, more resources, more everything." "Then we find them," Logan said. "We build a network, a resistance, a warning system." "The Cactiflinus resistance," Webb suggested, not quite smiling. "The Desert Watch," Voss countered. "The Keepers," Logan said. "Because that's what we are, keepers of knowledge, keepers of the warning, keepers of the flame." They stood in the laboratory, 3 humans against the ancient darkness, and they knew that the war was just beginning. The Cactiflinus were expanding. The drought was spreading. The world was changing. But they were ready. They were watching. They were keeping the flame alive. And somewhere in the desert, in the saguaros, in the shadows, the ancient creatures stirred, aware that something had changed, that their prey was learning, adapting, fighting back. The war between human and Cactiflinus had begun. It would last for generations. Thank you for listening to today's stories. If you enjoyed, please leave a like and subscribe, so you don't miss the stories yet to come.